Sheriff detectives say they found the nude body of a 43-year-old woman.
Every nightly newscast reporting the discovery of yet another woman stabbed, strangled, raped, and murdered.
It has happened again.
He would rape each of these women and then, to cover it up, beat them to death, stab them to death.
From 1994 to 2004, Sean Vincent Gillis terrorized Baton Rouge, Louisiana, as he brutally murdered 8 women. But his crimes went far beyond just killing. Gillis dismembered his victims, raped their corpses, kept body parts as twisted souvenirs, and even cannibalized their remains. His acts of unspeakable horror were so vile that even he admitted he was pure evil. While he readily confessed to his chilling crimes and may have shown some genuine remorse, the gruesome details of his murders are enough to cement his legacy as one of the most horrifying killers in history. Sean Vincent Gillis was truly a monster, and his actions will leave you questioning how anyone could ever commit such unimaginable evil. Sean Vincent Gillis was born on June 24, 1962. His mother loved him dearly and called him her little blue-eyed angel. But his childhood was marred by darkness. His father abandoned them and once threatened their lives with a gun. Though they escaped that night, the trauma lingered in Sean's mind. As he grew up, Sean developed an unusual fascination with death and funeral homes. While other kids shied away from such things, he found himself drawn to them. He even snuck into a funeral home with his cousin once.
I tried to kill my cousin once to feel her breath up. How old were you? Oh, we were about 12, 13.
What about funeral homes?
Funeral homes. This will go back to the childhood. I spent a lot of time at my grandmother at a funeral home right across the street. And me and my cousin, we would do morbid things like sleep in the coffins. A lot of people can't believe that, but we do it.
Sean lived what seemed like a normal life on the outside, hanging out with friends and going to movies. But there was always something lurking beneath the surface. As he entered his teenage years, he and his friends found themselves drawn into a dark world of secrets and shadows. They began to take a secret interest in devil worship, sneaking off to watch Satanists practice their chilling rituals. These acts filled them with a mix of fear and excitement, a dangerous thrill that only deepened their bond. At 17, Sean Vincent Gillis briefly reunited with his father, Norman. But when he stumbled upon Norman's collection of gay adult films, disgust washed over him. This moment marked a turning point. He cut ties with his father completely. It's puzzling to think that this encounter left Sean feeling dirty and grossed out, considering the horrific path he would soon embark upon. In 1980, at just 17 years old, Sean was arrested for petty crimes like traffic violations and possession of marijuana, nothing violent yet. After graduating high school, he took a job at a convenience store but lacked ambition and motivation. Then he discovered the dark allure of adult entertainment on the internet, becoming obsessed with websites featuring violent and disturbing content. His computer became his best friend, opening the door to a world filled with depravity. In 1992, Sean's mother, Yvonne, moved to Georgia for work and asked him to join her. He refused and stayed behind, living off her support while indulging in his dark interests. With Yvonne out of state, he had all the time in the world to explore adult entertainment and other sinister online materials. As his obsession grew, so did the suspicion from his neighbors. They found it strange when they heard him howling in the middle of the night. Women felt uneasy around him. He had already been caught peeping into someone's bedroom window. Despite these oddities, Sean Vincent Gillis had not yet crossed into violence, at least not publicly. In 1994, he met Terry Lou Mo through a mutual friend. Surprisingly, they hit it off immediately. Terry thought Sean was sweet and cute, a teddy bear of sorts. They bonded over their love for science fiction and collecting memorabilia. For nearly 9 years, their relationship seemed stable despite Sean's quirks. Terry overlooked Sean's heavy drinking and lack of intimacy, attributing it to his obsession with adult entertainment. Little did she know just how dark his interests truly were. While she went to bed alone most nights, Sean remained glued to his computer screen in a world where nightmares came alive. On March 20th, 1994, everything changed when Sean committed his first brutal murder. He targeted an elderly woman named Brian, who was 81 years old and living in an assisted facility. She left her door unlocked for a nurse who would come in the next morning. Under the cover of darkness, Sean crept inside with malicious intent. When and screamed as he attempted to assault her, panic surged through him like ice water. To silence her cries forever, he viciously cut her throat before stabbing her nearly 50 times all over her body. An act so savage it left her disemboweled and nearly decapitated. The next morning, her caretaker discovered Anne's lifeless body. There were no witnesses and no clues pointing to her killer. The horrific murder sent shockwaves through the community and left police baffled with no suspects or leads in sight. Shortly after this gruesome act, Terry moved in with Sean without knowing the monster lurking beneath his surface. For 5 long years, Sean Vincent Gillis managed to keep his dark urges at bay. Some might wonder if his love for Terry kept him in check, but deep down, many doubted it. If there were any other victims during this time, they were likely still unsolved. On January 4th, 1999, that restraint shattered when Gillis murdered Catherine in Hall, a 29-year-old sex worker. Catherine willingly entered his car that night, believing it was just another business transaction. But as she performed her act, Sean unleashed a nightmare. He attempted to strangle her with a zip tie he ominously nicknamed the Objectifier. Despite her desperate fight for survival, Sean overpowered her and stabbed her 16 times. Once she lay lifeless, he committed unspeakable acts upon her corpse before mutilating her body. Afterward, he drove to the splash car wash to erase any trace of his horrific crime. In the dead of night, he pulled Catherine's body from his car and laid it on the ground, hidden from the world. No one saw anything. Sean callously dumped Catherine's naked body on a rural road beneath a dead-end sign, where a hunter would later discover her remains. During the autopsy, evidence emerged. Pubic hair found in her mouth would eventually lead to DNA testing. Sean referred to his weapon as the Objectifier, revealing his twisted mindset. It would turn them into an object that I would then deal with. In the wake of this brutal murder, Terry Luemo grew uneasy. Suffering from grand mal seizures, she relied on Sean to drive her to work at a nearby location, just across the street from where he had killed Brian years earlier. Unbeknownst to her, she was living dangerously close to a monster. Only 4 months later, Gillis set his sights on another victim, 52-year-old Hardy Schmidt. For 3 weeks, he stalked her during her morning jogs. On May 30th, 1999, at around 6:30 a.m., Sean ran Hardy down with his car, knocking her into a ditch. He rushed out and strangled her, just enough to instill fear but not enough to kill immediately. After dragging the terrified woman into his vehicle, he drove to a nearby park where he violated and murdered her. After mutilating Hardy's body, he stuffed her naked and bloody remains into his trunk before heading home. The next night, when he picked up Terry after her shift, she complained about a strong odor in the car. Sean brushed it off as having recently hit an animal and promised to clean it up soon. Terry had no idea of the horror hidden in that trunk. On June 1st, Hardy Schmidt's body was discovered by a cyclist in St. James Parish Bayou next to the highway. Initially, her husband became a suspect until DNA evidence cleared him of any wrongdoing. Just months later, Sean Vincent Gillis was hunting again for the perfect prey and soon found it in 36-year-old Joyce Williams. He was captivated by Joyce's beautiful legs, a trait that drew him in like a moth to a flame. On November 12th of that year, he picked her up in Scotlandville and drove her across the Mississippi River to a sugarcane field near Port Allen. There, he strangled Joyce with the Objectifier before taking her lifeless body back home. In a shocking display of depravity, Sean autopsied Joyce's body in the kitchen, where he and Terry usually prepared their meals. He violated Joyce's corpse before consuming parts of it, a grotesque act that revealed just how far gone he truly was. After severing one of her legs with a hacksaw and decapitating her, he stuffed the dismembered parts into bags and loaded them into his car. Somehow, Sean managed to clean up the gruesome scene before picking Terry up from work that day. She suspected nothing as she rode alongside him, unaware that just hours earlier he had taken another innocent life. On January 22, 2000, Joyce Williams' remains were discovered in a wooded area in Iberville Parish. Within the same month, Gillis struck again, this time killing 52-year-old sex worker Lillian Robinson using the same zip tie method as before. He hurriedly took Lillian home but didn't have time to indulge in his usual gruesome rituals due to Terry's imminent return from work. A month later, Lillian's body was found near Whiskey Bay. An autopsy revealed she had drowned after being tossed off a bridge, a horrifying fate at the hands of a man who could no longer control his monstrous impulses. In October of that same year, tragedy struck again when 38-year-old Marilyn Neveles fell victim to Sean's sadistic path near Lafayette. She managed to escape momentarily but was caught again and beaten to death with a steel rod before being dumped into the Mississippi River levee near Baton Rouge. Marilyn's decomposing body was discovered on Halloween, a chilling reminder of the evil lurking within their community. As the investigation into the chilling murders continued, police began to focus on new crimes that sent shivers down the spines of Baton Rouge residents. In August 2002, a task force was formed to catch the elusive Baton Rouge killer. Profilers warned them to look for a white male, likely a loner raised by his mother, someone obsessed with knives and driven by a monstrous desire to kill. This was no ordinary predator. He was a monster who felt like a god in his twisted universe. In May 2003, the police arrested a 34-year-old man named Derek Todd Lee for a string of murders, and the media celebrated, believing they had caught the infamous killer. But little did they know, another monster lurked in the shadows, Sean Vincent Gillis. Obsessed with Lee, Gillis created a file on his computer labeled DTL, filled with news articles and photos about Lee's crimes. He became infatuated with his competitor, watching as Lee taunted police and evaded justice. Terry Lou M.O., Sean's girlfriend, noticed he was putting an unusual number of miles on their car. She assumed he was cheating on her, but in reality, Sean was stalking and planning his next horrific kill. In October 2003, he crossed a terrifying line. He murdered someone he had known for 10 years, Joni Mae Williams, a divorced mother of 3 and sex worker. They had partied together and shared laughs, but that night would end in unimaginable horror. Sean drove Joni to a secluded area where he brutally beat her before intimately violating her. He strangled her and stabbed her repeatedly, leaving her body mutilated in ways that would haunt anyone who heard the details. When police discovered Joni's remains, they found her hands had been removed, a gruesome signature of Gillis's depravity. He even confessed later that dismemberment occurred on his kitchen floor, where blood stained the tiles. Sean's final victim was 43-year-old Donna Bennett, another sex worker who was intoxicated when he picked her up on February 26, 2004. He strangled her not far from his home and then cut her body apart with horrifying precision. Allegedly, he even consumed parts of her flesh, a monstrous act that showed just how far his evil desires had spiraled out of control. When Donna's body was discovered in a drainage canal the next day, investigators found fresh tire tracks near the crime scene. Armed with crime scene photos and tire impressions, police contacted Goodyear Tire Company to identify what kind of vehicle used those tires. The answer shocked them. It was a white Chevrolet Cavalier, a car owned by only 90 people in Baton Rouge. As detectives began interviewing everyone on that list, hopes rose that they might finally connect the dots leading to the killer behind all these bodies. Among them was Sean Vincent Gillis, number 26 on the list of tire owners. He had no criminal record and wasn't even considered a suspect when detectives knocked on his door. But during their questioning, Sean made suspicious statements about Joni Mae Williams, admitting she was not only a friend but had also been in his car recently. He claimed he had been in the area of the crime scene because he needed to relieve himself, a flimsy excuse that did nothing to convince investigators. When asked if they would find Joni's blood in his car, Gillis casually replied yes, claiming she had gotten her period accidentally while sitting in his front seat. His absurd excuse about how blood could have ended up there sounded more like a bad joke than an explanation for such a horrific crime. As police delved deeper into Sean Vincent Gillis's life and actions, it became clear they were dealing with a cunning predator who managed to evade capture while leaving behind a trail of terror and tragedy throughout Baton Rouge. Major Brian White had a chilling realization. He had caught the other Baton Rouge killer. The moment Sean Vincent Gillis blamed the wind during his police interview, White felt a wave of certainty wash over him. He excused himself from the room and immediately ordered DNA analysis on the cheek swab taken from Gillis, along with a search warrant for his car and home. White was confident he had his man, but he knew he couldn't hold Sean indefinitely based on circumstantial evidence alone. Hours dragged on as investigators anxiously awaited lab results and a judge's approval for the warrant. Finally, on April 29, 2004, a SWAT team stormed Gillis's home around 12:20 a.m. Terry Luemo, Sean's girlfriend, was oblivious to the chaos unfolding around her. Police quickly informed her that she had been living with a serial killer, a revelation that shattered her world. Like many partners of killers, she had been completely unaware of the monster hidden behind the facade of love. Terry struggled to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the horrifying truth that now confronted her. "That's not the Sean I knew," she insisted, but the Sean she loved likely never truly existed. As she asked to speak with him, they allowed a phone call. When Terry learned why police arrested him, she laughed in disbelief, thinking they must have made a mistake. But when they revealed that Sean had confessed, her laughter turned to shock. During their conversation, when Terry questioned Sean about his crimes, he chillingly admitted to everything. Armed with a search warrant, detectives uncovered an arsenal of weapons in his home. 7 swords, several knives, a machete, a 14-inch bayonet, wooden clubs, and zip ties, his tools of terror. They also seized computers filled with grotesque photographs of Joni Mae Williams's body and disturbing books about serial killers. On his computer, investigators found files detailing Russian necrophilia and gruesome murders like the Manson family killings and various beheadings. Justice was finally closing in on Sean Vincent Gillis, and there was no escaping it now. In an astonishing confession at 7 a.m., Gillis admitted to murdering 8 women. However, his taped confession was deemed inadmissible in court because he had requested an attorney just before boasting about his crimes. He recounted each murder in grotesque detail, laughing and joking about the sick acts he committed against his victims. He even revealed his favorite weapon, the objectifier, a white nylon zip tie measuring 2.5 feet long. Gillis described how he played with Donna Johnston's remains at his house, washing her body in the shower and even painting her nails post-mortem. His chilling nonchalance about these horrific acts showcased just how deeply disturbed he truly was. The investigation into Sean Vincent Gillis revealed not just a killer but a monster who reveled in his gruesome acts. A predator who stalked and tortured innocent women while hiding behind the mask of an ordinary life. As police pieced together evidence from his confessions and the horrors found in his home, it became clear that justice would be served for those whose lives he so callously extinguished. The streets of Baton Rouge would never forget the terror that lurked within their midst, a reminder that evil can wear many faces and often hides in plain sight. None of the gruesome details of Sean Vincent Gillis's confessions could be used at trial, but Major Brian White was determined not to let a serial killer slip through the cracks on a mere technicality. The authorities needed hard, irrefutable evidence to secure a conviction, and fortune smiled upon them when the search of Sean's home revealed a chilling trove of evidence. 45 digital photos of Donna Bennett Johnston, including one showing her lifeless body in the trunk of his car. But that was just the beginning. Disturbingly, photographs of his other victims were also found, with one image even capturing Sean's license plate alongside one of the bodies. If that wasn't horrifying enough, Sean had kept some of his victims' body parts as macabre souvenirs, trophies from his heinous crimes. There is no doubt that Gillis is among America's most monstrous killers. Psychologist Joni Johnson described him as someone whose thrill came not from the act of killing itself but from what happened afterward. He's attracted to the body parts of these dead corpses, she said, highlighting a rare and disturbing fascination. FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Loughlin revealed an even darker secret. Sean had confessed to her that he was attracted to his own mother. He chillingly remarked that if she had passed away, they might have found him in bed with her. One can only wonder if his mother ever sensed something was off about her son. Was that why she moved to Georgia and continued to financially support him while he lived alone in Baton Rouge? In a twist of fate, a longtime friend of Joni Johnston named Tammy Papera began writing letters to Gillis, and shockingly, he responded. In those letters, He detailed the brutal killing of Johnston, revealing his twisted psyche. "I still puzzle over the post-mortem dismemberment. I was pure evil that night. No love, no compassion, no faith, no mercy." Tammy sadly passed away in 2005 from a long-term illness, but not before turning those chilling letters over to police as crucial evidence for future convictions. It was Tammy who ultimately put the final nail in Sean's coffin. As the trial approached, the prosecutor hoped for the death penalty, but jurors were split and could not reach a unanimous decision. One juror even claimed he could never agree to a death sentence, a sentiment that seemed almost absurd in light of Gillis's atrocities. Meanwhile, another juror expressed a desire to be part of a firing squad if it meant delivering justice to this monster. On July 21, 2008, Gillis was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The previous year, he had pleaded guilty to the murder of Joyce Williams and received another life sentence for that crime. Now at 60 years old, he spends his days isolated in Louisiana State Penitentiary, a stark contrast to the vibrant lives stolen from 7 of his victims. According to an interview with Crime Watch Daily, Terry Luemo still resides in the house she shared with Gillis. She insists that the house itself is just a building and holds no evil energy. Strangely enough, she still keeps the bloody Chevy Cavalier used during his reign of terror, a rusting hunk of metal rotting away in her backyard. Despite renovating her home and claiming it carries no negativity, one can only wonder how she would feel if she came home to find her partner playing with his victims on their kitchen floor. People cope in different ways. Perhaps Terry has found solace in denial. As for Sean Vincent Gillis, one can only hope he does his coping in hell or somewhere equally fitting for a man who brought so much pain and suffering into this world. Rest in peace to all the victims mentioned in this horrific tale. Luis Alfredo Garavito, infamously known as the Beast, was a monster whose heinous acts left a chilling mark on Colombia's history. Between 1992 and 1999, he preyed upon and brutalized an estimated 400 children and teenagers, transforming from a troubled alcoholic into one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. Despite attending Alcoholics Anonymous and seeking redemption through religion, Garavito's dual life revealed a horrifying truth. He frequented Valencia Park, a notorious hotspot for child prostitution, where he indulged his insatiable thirst for violence. His crimes escalated from molestation to torture, using ropes, candles, and razors, tools reminiscent of the horrors he endured in his own childhood. After each brutal attack, he inscribed the names of his young victims in a blue notebook, praying for their souls while simultaneously indulging in his darkest desires. Garavito's fascination with the macabre extended beyond his crimes. He developed an obsession with Adolf Hitler and World War II, finding twisted admiration in the depths of human depravity. As law enforcement struggled to connect the dots amidst a wave of disappearances, Garavito blended into society, posing as a monk or street vendor to lure children. His facade concealed a remorseless predator who would stop at nothing to satisfy his horrifying appetite for destruction. The question loomed large. How many innocent lives would he claim before the world finally caught up with him? It was a regular afternoon on November 7th, 1998, in Pereira, Colombia, a small city nestled in the beautiful Andes Mountains. Children were playing football in a grassy field, their laughter filling the air. Among them was a young boy who chased the ball into a corner of an empty lot. But what he found there would change everything. As he ran, he spotted something unusual, a human skull. His heart raced as he called for help. When the police arrived, they quickly realized that this skull was too small to belong to an adult. Their investigation revealed that it belonged to a boy, likely between the ages of 11 and 13. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community, leaving everyone feeling uneasy and fearful. This tragic finding was just the beginning of a much darker story. In Colombia during the 1990s, a group of children known as the Disposables faced unimaginable hardships. These children, around 60,000 in total, lived on the streets, with many lacking formal education. About 20,000 of them were in the capital city, Bogota. They struggled to survive in a world that seemed to have forgotten them. From a very young age, some of these children turned to drugs, smoking leftover cocaine as early as 6 years old. Others found themselves involved in prostitution by the time they were just 9. The boys often joined gangs, engaging in street violence that sometimes led to tragic outcomes. They fought each other with makeshift weapons like clubs and broken bottles, all while searching for the best places to sleep at night. Without families to protect them, they became easy targets for dangerous adults and criminal groups. When these children went missing, few people noticed. Many had never seen a dentist or received proper care, making it impossible to identify their remains if they were found. This meant that when a boy's skull was discovered in Pereira, it was not treated as a priority by the police. Sadly, it seemed that society had turned its back on them. However, as reports of missing children began to rise, both disposables and those with families, concern spread across Colombia. Parents were terrified as they realized their children were disappearing at alarming rates. In Pereira alone, dozens of children had gone missing in just 1 year. On November 15, 1998, police uncovered a mass grave containing the bodies of 36 children. As they continued their investigation, they found even more bodies scattered across various sites. The total number reached 41, prompting a nationwide investigation into the disappearances. Initially, investigators considered various theories. Perhaps a satanic cult or a trafficking ring was responsible for these horrific acts. But the evidence pointed toward something more sinister, a single serial killer who had been preying on vulnerable children. The police suspected this might be the work of Pedro Lopez, known as the Monster of the Andes, who had previously confessed to killing hundreds of children across Colombia and its neighboring countries. Yet there were key differences between Lopez's known methods and the recent killings. As investigators dug deeper into the case, they discovered that many of the bodies had been buried for some time. This raised doubts about whether Lopez could be responsible for all these crimes, since he had been released from a mental institution just months before the bodies were found. The bodies of the children found were not the work of Pedro Lopez. While Pedro Lopez had targeted young girls, these new graves contained predominantly young boys, aged between 6 and 13. The signs of violence were shocking. These boys had suffered extreme torture before their deaths, with their bodies showing signs of severe mutilation. The details were grim. The victims had been beaten, burned, stabbed, and even decapitated. It was a nightmare that no one could have imagined. This was not just a case of murder. It was the work of an entirely different monster. The pain these boys endured before their tragic end was unimaginable, and it became clear that this was not Pedro Lopez doing. When the true perpetrator was eventually caught, he faced a trial that revealed the extent of his horrific actions. He was sentenced to an astonishing 1,853 years and 9 days in prison. However, due to Colombian laws that capped prison sentences at 40 years, he would only serve a fraction of that time. This rule frustrated many who believed that such heinous crimes deserved a more fitting punishment. Despite his confession and cooperation with the police in finding more victims, his sentence was reduced to just 22 years. He spent much of that time in La Tramacua, a notorious maximum security prison, kept in solitary confinement for his own safety. Inmates feared for their lives if they were to encounter him. In Luis Alfredo Garavito, a man whose actions would haunt Colombia forever. Born on January 25, 1957, Garavito grew up in Genova, a small town in Colombia's coffee region. His childhood was marked by turmoil as Colombia faced violent conflicts starting in 1964. He was the eldest of 7 siblings in a family that struggled with poverty and domestic strife. While Garavito himself provided many details about his difficult upbringing, there are reasons to believe he may have exaggerated some aspects to excuse his later actions. According to Garavito, his father was a violent alcoholic who abused his children and isolated them from others. He often belittled Garavito, calling him names that would leave lasting scars. The family dynamic was strained. His father had affairs outside the marriage while his mother retaliated with her own infidelities. In such an environment of fear and neglect, it's no wonder that Garavito's childhood was far from normal. He described his father as someone who created an atmosphere where laughter and play were rare due to the constant threat of violence. The children often hid from him when he returned home from work, fearing the unpredictable outbursts that could lead to punishment. He recalled moments of tenderness with his own children, but his memories quickly turned to the horrors of his past. According to Garavito, his father, Manuel, was not only a violent alcoholic but also someone who may have molested him. He described a vague memory of being fondled at night, a violation that left him with deep scars. The home environment was chaotic. Garavito's parents often engaged in loud arguments, throwing insults at each other. Their fights could become physical, with both parents striking each other. Garavito claimed he tried to defend his mother during these altercations, which only drew his father's wrath upon him. At the age of 6 or 7, he attempted to protect his pregnant mother from a severe beating and was punished brutally. His father tied him to a tree and flogged him with a machete. His mother, Rosa, was also abusive in her own right. Although she did not drink, she directed her anger and resentment toward her children. Garavito described her as neglectful and emotionally distant, raising her children with little affection or care. When he started school at age 7 after moving to another town, things did not improve. He wore glasses and was teased by classmates. They called him Gabato, which means squiggle, a nickname that felt hurtful despite its seemingly harmless sound. During recess, he often played alone while struggling academically. As he faced bullying, Garavito's anger sometimes erupted into violence, leading to further isolation from his peers. At 10 years old, he began to realize he might be attracted to boys when another boy touched him innocently, sparking feelings he did not understand. Garavito's sexual orientation remains ambiguous. He claimed attraction to women but often expressed a stronger attraction to young boys. He described feeling drawn to early adolescent boys and admitted that his desires extended even younger. At 12 or 13, Garavito's situation worsened when he was taken out of school due to poor grades and forced to work for his family. It was during this time that he faced additional abuse from a neighbor, a man who was a family friend and deeply religious. This neighbor allegedly assaulted Garavito regularly when his father took him for medical treatment. The abuse included horrific acts: being strapped down, burned with candle wax, cut with a knife, and bitten on sensitive areas of his body. Garavito did not tell his parents about this ongoing abuse because he feared they would not believe him. The troubling details of Luis Garavito's past raise questions about the nature of his experiences and how they shaped his later actions. Some criminal psychologists believe that Garavito may have fabricated stories of abuse by his neighbor for his own sexual gratification during therapy sessions. Instead of sharing genuine trauma, he might have been creating erotic tales that blurred the lines between his experiences of violence and sexuality. Garavito himself claimed that the abuse he suffered awakened a disturbing desire within him. He recounted feeling a deep sadness and longing during those moments, saying, "The only thing I wanted at that moment is to have self-deleted myself." In his recollections, Garavito described how, after enduring the abuse, he turned to harming animals. He recalled killing 2 little birds and tearing them apart, a reflection of the turmoil brewing inside him. Shortly after this incident, Garavito claimed he molested a 6-year-old boy and began to assault his younger siblings. He described how he would suggest they take off their clothes and would fondle them while they slept. The abuse from the neighbor allegedly continued for 2 years until Garavito was 14 years old. During this time, the family moved to a new town where another neighbor assaulted him. This man reportedly introduced Garavito to pornography, and when Garavito reacted negatively, he was beaten and sexually assaulted. There remains uncertainty about whether these claims are true or if they were invented by Garavito as a way to rationalize his future crimes, or even as a form of sadomasochistic fantasy during therapy sessions. His history illustrates the complexities of his mental state. Experts noted that he exhibited traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder, manipulative and deceitful behaviors that made it difficult to trust his accounts. By 1972, Garavito's narrative shifted from that of a victim to an aggressive predator. At just 15 years old, he began engaging in more violent behaviors. Alcohol played a significant role in this transformation. It exacerbated his already troubled mind and fueled his antisocial tendencies. He was not alone in this. Many notorious serial killers have shared a similar connection to drinking. For instance, Jeffrey Dahmer often needed alcohol to numb his emotions before he could commit his gruesome acts. Ted Bundy relied on liquor to bolster his courage during his early crimes, while others, like Aileen Wuornos, would down 20 beers in a single day while hitchhiking and murdering men along the roads. Garavito's story reveals a chilling truth. He never lost the need for alcohol to unleash the monster within him. While many killers might have found their impulses weakened over time, Garavito remained dependent on booze to transform from a timid man into a torturer and murderer. When sober, he was well-mannered and reserved, but once he drank, he became a violent predator. As a teenager, Garavito had early access to alcohol, gravitating toward cheap brandy. Colombia's relaxed attitudes toward underage drinking made it easy for him to sneak drinks from home or buy liquor from stores. The culture around drinking in Colombia often involved moderate consumption, but for Garavito, it became an escape that led him down a dark path. His family history played a significant role in his relationship with alcohol. Growing up with an alcoholic father and a lineage of heavy drinkers, Garavito was predisposed to addiction. His mother, although a teetotaler, came from a family of drinkers, which only added to the toxic environment surrounding him. By the time he was 15, Garavito's life was dominated by drunken escapades. He sought out older women and girls, trying to summon the courage to connect with them through alcohol. However, his attempts were often met with rejection due to his off-putting drunken behavior. The booze that was meant to liberate him only served to deepen his isolation. As he continued down this path of self-destruction, Garavito's drinking became more than just social. It morphed into a permanent fixture in his life. Alcohol removed his inhibitions but also led him closer to the horrific desires that would define his future actions. Each drink pushed him further into the abyss, transforming him from a troubled boy into one of history's most notorious serial killers. In late 1972, a horrifying incident marked a turning point in Luis Garavito's life. Under the influence of alcohol, he was caught by his mother attempting to force himself on a 5-year-old boy. This shocking event ignited something dark within him, awakening a twisted desire for sexual sadism. It is unclear if this was the only child he targeted that year, but it was certainly the only time he was caught. Garavito later claimed that his parents were disgusted by his actions, leading to his temporary expulsion from their home for a week or two. However, the police were never involved, and no charges were filed. This lack of accountability allowed Garavito to continue down his dark path without facing any real consequences. By 1973, at just 16 years old, Garavito's predatory behavior escalated. He traveled widely, possibly to evade detection as he sought out new victims. His next attempt occurred at a train station in Bogota, where he tried to assault a 6-year-old boy. The boy screamed in terror, attracting the attention of nearby authorities. The brazen nature of this attempted assault could be attributed to Garavito's intoxication at the time. When questioned by police, Garavito denied any intent to commit serious harm, claiming instead that he merely wanted to lightly abuse the child. This absurd justification highlighted his complete lack of understanding of the gravity of his actions. Following this incident, Garavito was permanently thrown out of his home, but this did little to deter him. Incredibly, Garavito's father did not object to the assault on principle. Instead, he expressed disappointment that it was a homosexual act rather than an attack on a woman. This disturbing reaction further illustrates the toxic environment in which Garavito was raised. With nowhere to go, the young man found himself among Colombia's homeless youth, many of whom were exploited for cheap labor or recruited by paramilitary groups. He initially found work on a coffee plantation but soon became embroiled in a cycle of violence and addiction. In early 1974, at 17 years old, Garavito left his hometown in search of better opportunities. He drifted between cities, taking odd jobs and even attending night classes in marketing. However, his chronic alcoholism sabotaged any chance of stability or success. He frequently showed up to work drunk and aggressive, leading to conflicts with coworkers and ultimately resulting in his dismissal. As he bounced from job to job, Garavito's personal life mirrored this chaos. He formed platonic friendships with women and attempted romantic relationships, but often turned violent when intoxicated. His struggles with erectile dysfunction added another layer of complexity to his already troubled psyche. Rather than being caused by alcohol alone, it stemmed from his lack of attraction to the women he pursued. Luis Garavito's life was a twisted tapestry of addiction and violence, woven together by his struggles with identity and the dark impulses that plagued him. It seems likely that Garavito was primarily homosexual, but societal pressures led him to act out in ways that proved he was a red-blooded male, as he desperately sought to conform to expectations. His relationships with women quickly soured under the weight of his alcoholism, transforming him into a monster capable of verbal and physical abuse. When sober, Garavito could appear caring and remorseful toward his girlfriends, but the cycle of drinking would inevitably lead to threats, beatings, and drunken tirades. After enduring enough of his violent outbursts, the women in his life would finally throw him out, spreading word of his abusive behavior throughout their communities. This pattern forced Garavito to move from town to town, always seeking new victims while wearing out his welcome. Despite his turbulent relationships, Garavito maintained a close bond with his sister Esther, the only family member he kept in touch with after being expelled from his childhood home. However, even Esther tried to limit her contact with him due to his alcoholism and aggressive behavior. Garavito's deep-seated animosity toward his family manifested in drunken rants about how he hated his mother and siblings, often expressing a desire to harm his father. From 1974 to 1978, Garavito's predatory behavior escalated dramatically. Although it's unclear how many children he assaulted during this time, reports suggest the number could be in the double digits. He claimed that he preyed on both young boys and girls, possibly as a misguided attempt to prove his masculinity. Among the most vulnerable were the disposables, impoverished children who roamed the streets of Colombia. Garavito exploited these children mercilessly. He was rough and sadistic, often beating and threatening them. Yet at this point, he had not yet crossed the line into murder, a horrific threshold he would soon breach. By 1978, at just 21 years old, Garavito's alcoholism had plunged him into deep depression and thoughts of self-destruction. In a desperate attempt for change, he joined Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, which had made its way to Colombia from the United States. During this time, he was introduced to Pentecostalism through a fellow AA member. The lively ceremonies filled with music and fervent faith, healing reignited a flicker of belief in the divine within him. The allure of being cleansed of sin appealed strongly to Garavito. Unlike Catholicism, which emphasized penance for unforgivable acts, Pentecostalism offered a simpler path to salvation, accepting Jesus as one's savior. Garavito believed that through this declaration of faith, he could absolve himself of his heinous past and enter heaven despite being a sexual sadist and relentless child predator. This delusion painted a grotesque picture of redemption that allowed him to continue living with himself. In addition to AA meetings and church services, Garavito sought counseling for his depression and alcohol abuse over 5 grueling years. Yet even as he attempted to confront his demons, the streets remained filled with disposables, children who were often overlooked by society and left vulnerable to predators like him. Despite his attempts to seek help, he frequently fell back into the bottle, continuing his predatory behavior against children. He never discussed his attraction to minors or the crimes he committed with any of his counselors, maintaining a double life that was as deceptive as it was dangerous. Garavito's internal struggle was marked by cognitive dissonance. He grappled with his hopes for redemption while simultaneously preying on society's most vulnerable. By day, he attended church services, publicly displaying remorse and beating his chest during prayers. But by night, he transformed into a predator, lurking in parks and alleyways to solicit the sexual services of street children or lure unsuspecting kids away from their families. In 1978, shortly after embracing Pentecostalism, Garavito moved to Seja and found work at a grocery store. There, he reignited a friendship with Luth Mary Ampo, a cashier at the same store. In her presence, he managed to stay sober and present himself as kind and gentle. He shared tales of his religious conversion and dreams of salvation, but unbeknownst to Ampo, his alcoholism still raged beneath the surface. After a few months, Garavito's true nature surfaced again. He was fired for absenteeism and showing up drunk at work when Ampo wasn't around. With nowhere else to turn, he relocated to Armenia and found a job at a local bakery. Although he managed to keep things stable at work for a time, he continued to prey on young children, often visiting Valencia Park to solicit vulnerable kids as young as 9. As the early 1980s approached, Garavito's drinking spiraled out of control once more. After getting into fights with co-workers while intoxicated, he was promptly fired again. Unemployed and homeless, he sank deeper into depression, plagued by thoughts of self-destruction. His struggles with bulimia compounded his problems. Standing at just 5 feet 5 inches, he became dangerously thin. In the spring of 1980, Garavito checked himself into San Juan Dios Hospital in Manizales for psychiatric treatment. There, doctors discovered that he was suffering from paranoia and hallucinations. During therapy sessions, he confessed to having desires for children, but quickly retracted his statement, claiming he merely wanted to start a family. Despite these admissions, Garavito ultimately chose not to disclose his true predatory urges. After a few weeks of treatment, he was released and returned to Armenia, where he found work at another grocery store. It was here that he charmed Claudia, a single mother and hairstylist. He presented himself as kind and considerate around her child, an act that would have been chilling if anyone had known the truth about him. Garavito later claimed that Claudia was the first woman whose company he genuinely enjoyed. This statement seemed contradictory given his professed love for Luth Mary Ampo. It highlighted the complexity of his character. A man capable of charm and kindness on the surface while harboring dark desires that would soon lead him down an even more sinister path. After his relationship with Claudia ended, partly due to her mercenary attitude toward men and Garavito's meager earnings as a stock boy, he fell deeper into his predatory behaviors. With generous 2-hour lunch breaks at the grocery store, he took advantage of the time to travel to nearby towns like Quimbaya and Quimbaya, where he would drink cheap brandy and seek out vulnerable children. Garavito's method was sinisterly simple. He would lure impoverished kids from marketplaces or parks with promises of money for odd jobs. Once they were isolated, his true nature emerged. He would become progressively drunker, using his inebriation as a cover for the horrific acts that followed. He not only assaulted these children but also inflicted brutal physical violence upon them, echoing the abuse he had suffered as a child. By the autumn of 1980, Garavito's sadism escalated to new depths. He began torturing his victims with candle wax, burning them with lighters, and cutting them with razor blades. In some cases, he even amputated their toes. In a grotesque act of self-mutilation, he removed one of his own front teeth to enhance his ability to inflict pain on others. Despite these horrific actions, Garavito had not yet crossed the line into murder. The chilling question remained: how was he able to evade capture for so long? The answer lay in the societal neglect surrounding the disposables, the impoverished children whom no one seemed to care about. Garavito preyed upon an estimated 15 to 25 children each year, not counting those he solicited for sex and subjected to the same cruel treatment. By this time, his victims numbered in the triple digits. To minimize detection, Garavito quit his job at the grocery store and became a street vendor, selling trinkets and religious icons while traveling across Colombia. This new guise allowed him to blend into marketplaces without raising suspicion as he hunted for victims. His only goal was to earn enough money for food and alcohol while maintaining a facade of normalcy. Throughout the 1980s, Garavito occasionally found refuge with single mothers, using their homes as temporary shelters after long stints on the road. These tactics enabled him to continue his reign of terror, sexually assaulting and torturing an estimated 200 to 300 children between 1980 and 1992 without being caught. As we trace Garavito's movements during this dark period, we see spikes in reports of child abuse, a grim reflection of the horrors he inflicted on innocent lives. His cognitive dissonance persisted even as he grappled with feelings of guilt. During sober moments, he experienced deep depression about his actions. In desperate attempts for redemption, he would feverishly read the Bible at night, seeking passages that might justify his heinous behavior. In a disturbing ritual of self-punishment, Garavito would strip naked and hid himself in contrition while asking his victims their names, so he could record them in a blue notebook. Despite these moments of reflection, he found no solace. Instead, he often awoke from nightmares only to burst into manic laughter at the realization that his crimes brought him pleasure. The cycle of violence was far from over. It was merely gathering momentum toward its horrific climax. As he struggled with his demons, he turned to the bottle, believing it would quiet his depression and frustrations. But instead of finding peace, he found himself spiraling deeper into a world of evil. When his attempts to seek solace in the Bible failed, Garavito embraced the notion that he was pure evil, a belief that led him down a disturbing path into the realms of Satanism. He began indulging in black magic and seances, attempting to commune with the dead and summon dark spirits. Tarot cards became tools for foretelling the future as he visited occultists and fortune-tellers, soon convincing himself that he understood the spiritual underworld better than they did. Garavito claimed that the devil was speaking directly to him, issuing commands that he felt compelled to obey. This twisted logic allowed him to indulge in his sadistic desires while absolving himself of responsibility. After all, if an all-powerful evil being was directing his actions, how could he be blamed? This rationalization eliminated any cognitive dissonance he had previously felt. While some might argue that he experienced remorse, it was clear from his interviews and psychological evaluations that Garavito was a psychopath, incapable of feeling true empathy or guilt. His so-called remorse was merely an awareness of societal laws and moral norms. He knew that hurting children was illegal and morally reprehensible. Yet, rather than feeling genuine regret for his actions, he merely lamented how society would perceive him. In addition to embracing Satanism, Garavito became fascinated with Nazism, not out of ideological conviction but rather due to the sheer violence it represented. He read biographies of Adolf Hitler and accounts of World War II, drawing parallels between Hitler's rise from homelessness to dictatorship and his own life. Garavito admired Hitler's ruthless methods and found a disturbing thrill in the idea of mass executions, particularly the notion of victims digging their own graves before facing their doom. Garavito's fascination with violence extended to the infamous Colombian mass murderer Campo Ilidio Guardado, who had brutally killed 29 people in a single rampage. Inspired by Guardado's actions, Garavito began fantasizing about committing murders in front of journalists and crowds. He envisioned buying a machine gun and exacting vengeance on his family, dreaming of gunning down his father, mother, and siblings before turning the weapon on himself. These fantasies were wrapped in a sense of entitlement. Garavito felt wronged by the world and believed he deserved retribution. Yet despite these violent thoughts, harming an adult seemed daunting for him. He was short, thin, malnourished, and timid around others, a stark contrast to the monstrous persona he wished to embody. On January 25, 1984, after a night of heavy drinking, he fell into a psychotic state, cutting himself in public and landing himself in a psychiatric ward. Despite receiving treatment and being released with what was deemed a clean bill of health, Garavito wasted no time in returning to his horrific ways. Just hours after his release, he abducted, sexually assaulted, and tortured 2 boys in Pereira. Garavito's sister Esther unwittingly aided him by storing a bag containing the boys' identity cards. However, the boys soon spotted Garavito in public and alerted adults, forcing him to flee the city. The police failed to identify him based on witness descriptions, allowing him to slip away once again. This lack of urgency from law enforcement reflected a disturbing reality. The lives of poor children were often deemed unworthy of serious investigation. Continuing his charade of seeking help for his mental health, Garavito attended various mental hospitals but never disclosed his heinous crimes or his predatory inclinations. In 1984, he was arrested for petty theft but released without charges. It took 2 years for him to muster the audacity to return to Pereira, a city large enough for him to avoid recognition. Throughout 1986, Garavito resumed his life as a street vendor while stalking and assaulting children. After meeting Graciela Zabalita, a single mother, he moved in with her and presented himself as kind and responsible. However, as the alcohol took over, Graciela soon witnessed Garavito's violent side and ultimately asked him to leave. With nowhere else to turn, Garavito reinvented himself as a street vendor selling religious icons and fruit while continuing his predatory behavior. He developed cunning methods to avoid detection, disguising himself as a priest or beggar while luring children into isolated areas. By 1992, after having preyed on between 200 and 300 victims over 2 decades, Garavito began to feel apathetic toward his sexual assaults. The thrill had faded. He struggled to achieve climax during these acts of violence. Then came a fateful encounter with the supernatural. While using a Ouija board, he believed he heard the devil speak to him, offering him dark rewards for serving evil. On October 1st, 1992, while heavily intoxicated in a resort district near the Caribbean coast, Garavito spotted a young boy selling sweets. When the boy declined his offer for an odd job due to Garavito's drunken state, he became aggressive and groped the child. 2 police officers intervened and beat Garavito before dragging him to the station. Incredibly, he managed to bribe them with a watch and some cash, yet again escaping justice. Just days later, on October 4th, Garavito followed 13-year-old Juan Carlos through crowded streets before luring him away with promises of money. In an act of unimaginable cruelty, he assaulted Juan Carlos and then brutally murdered him, mutilating the body in an attempt to make it appear as if it were part of a satanic ritual. Garavito's reign of terror escalated from here. He unleashed horrors upon Colombia that had not been seen since Pedro Lopez's time. His victims were predominantly poor children, those who went missing without anyone caring enough to report it or follow up on their cases. The systemic neglect allowed Garavito to continue his horrific spree largely unchecked. He worked with charities that helped orphans and other kids in need, gaining access to places where children gathered. But this was a dangerous game because no one checked if he was safe to be around. They didn't know about the terrible secrets he kept hidden inside. Garavito was clever. He would come up with excuses to lure children away from their friends. Sometimes he promised them money for small jobs, and if they looked unsure, he would offer even more money until they agreed. Other times, he would tempt them with sweets or gifts. For some street children who were struggling with addiction, he even offered drugs that made them feel good for a moment. One day, after Halloween, Garavito spotted a young boy who had lost his candy during trick-or-treating. With a sweet smile, he told the boy that he could help him find it. The boy, trusting and hopeful, followed Garavito without knowing the danger that lay ahead. They walked for a long time, far away from where they started, until the boy was too tired to resist anymore. That's when Garavito struck. His attacks were sudden and filled with cruelty. What happened next was horrifying. He inflicted pain for what felt like an eternity, dragging out the nightmare longer than anyone could imagine. In 1993, he resumed the terrible things he had done before, burning, cutting, and biting his victims. But this time, he crossed an even darker line. Garavito began to disembowel his victims while they were still alive, making his attacks even more grotesque and terrifying. This gruesome act became a twisted signature of his crimes. In the town of La Victoria, Garavito lured 8 schoolboys, aged between 9 and 11, to a secluded area. With a deceptive smile, he bound them with rope, one by one, while the others helplessly watched in horror. As he moved from one child to the next, their eyes filled with fear and confusion. After he was done with each boy, Garavito would commit an even more chilling act. He severed their toes after they had died and kept them as trophies. He took pictures cut out from their identity cards to remember them by. But even this sickening behavior didn't last long. Fearing that the police would catch on to his gruesome trophies, Garavito eventually discarded the severed toes. Luis Garavito was not just a monster. He was a meticulous documenter of his own horrific deeds. Instead of hiding his crimes, he kept a little notebook where he recorded every chilling detail of the killings. He took photographs of his victims' lifeless bodies, capturing their innocence forever lost. Garavito even cut out newspaper articles that reported on his gruesome acts, keeping them as if they were trophies of his twisted success. He collected receipts and bus tickets from his journeys between towns, as if each piece of paper held a story of the terror he unleashed. All these dark mementos were stored away in a black cotton bag, hidden at his sister Esther's house. It was as if he wanted to create a scrapbook of horror, documenting his crimes for no one but himself to see. This chilling behavior showed that Garavito wasn't just committing acts of violence. He was relishing in them. His notebook and photographs were not merely records. They were a celebration of his monstrous actions. Each entry was a reminder of the lives he had shattered and the fear he had spread. After the horrific mass murder in La Victoria, Luis Garavito continued his reign of terror, traveling an hour north to Bogota. There, he unleashed his brutal methods on 11 more innocent victims. One by one, he tortured and murdered them, each act more chilling than the last. Garavito's depravity knew no bounds as he moved from town to town, seeking out new victims to satisfy his insatiable hunger for violence. In the latter part of 1993, Garavito hopped between towns like Pereira, Cumbaya, and Armenia, leaving a trail of sorrow and fear in his wake. He was relentless, taking the lives of dozens of children during this dark journey. By the end of that year, he escalated his gruesome acts even further. After killing his victims, he began removing their vital organs while they were still alive, a horrifying act that turned his already monstrous behavior into something even more grotesque. But Garavito didn't keep these organs as trophies. Instead, he discarded them at a second location. The rapid decomposition of the bodies and interference from wildlife made it almost impossible for anyone to find these gruesome remains. In 1994, Luis Garavito's reign of terror reached new depths of horror. He introduced a chilling new method of torture, flaying the skin off the victim's buttocks with a razor blade held tightly between his fingers. This gruesome act was just a prelude to the nightmare that awaited his next victim. On February 4th, in Bogota, Garavito spotted 13-year-old Jamie Gonzalez at Plaza Bolivar. With a deceptive smile, he lured the boy away on a long trek to a nearby sugarcane field. Garavito was already deeply intoxicated, having been thrown out of a bar after erupting in a drunken rage over the food. He continued to drink from a cheap bottle of brandy, his mind clouded with alcohol and malice. Once they reached the secluded field, Garavito unleashed his horrific intentions. After murdering Jamie, something unexpected happened. He caught sight of a nearby crucifix, which triggered a sudden and intense fear of God within him. Panic gripped him as he buried his knife in the ground and prayed for forgiveness, desperately seeking absolution for the monstrous act he had just committed. But the moment of remorse was fleeting. After digging up his knife again, Garavito retreated to a hotel room where he paced naked for hours, consumed by guilt and self-loathing. In a twisted ritual, he flogged himself while reciting Psalm 57. Be merciful unto me, O God, for my soul trusteth in thee. In the shadow of thy wings will I make my refuge, until these calamities be overpast. He shall send from heaven and save me from the reproach of him that would swallow me up. My soul is among lions, and I lie even among them that are set on fire, even the sons of men whose teeth are spears and arrows, and their tongue a sharp sword. These powerful lines revealed a chilling truth about Garavito, a man so consumed by his own narcissism that he could not see the reality of his actions. By choosing this particular psalm, Garavito was not seeking genuine repentance. Instead, he portrayed himself as a victim beset by the evils of the world. He begged God for rescue, failing to recognize that he was the greatest evil of all. In his twisted mind, he saw himself as King David, hiding from enemies who sought to destroy him, rather than acknowledging that he was the one inflicting pain and terror on innocent children. This delusion showcased his complete lack of accountability. While David called upon God to save him from slander and danger, Garavito used these same words to mask his own monstrous deeds. He painted himself as a hunted man instead of confronting the truth, that he was the predator lurking in the shadows, preying on vulnerable souls. While still in Bogota, Luis Garavito's monstrous tendencies spiraled even further into darkness. He spotted a 12-year-old boy sleeping on a bus and, with a sinister grin, offered him brandy. The intoxicating liquid clouded the boy's senses, making him an easy target for Garavito, who lured him into a nearby ravine. There, the chilling reality of Garavito's intentions unfolded as he stripped the boy of his clothes and began binding him with rope. But as Garavito prepared to unleash his horrors, a foul smell filled the air, the stench of rotting flesh. To his shock, they were standing next to a mass grave, a grim reminder of the countless lives lost to violence in Colombia. As Garavito recoiled from the horrific odor, the boy seized his chance for survival. In a desperate act of bravery, he grabbed Garavito's knife and slashed at the older man's hand, slicing through the tendons as Garavito raised his arms in defense. Despite this brave attempt to escape, Garavito ultimately overpowered the boy. With cold determination, he delivered the killing blow, a deep cut across the throat that silenced the child forever. In that moment of horror, Garavito felt a twisted sense of climax, reveling in the power he held over life and death. But his depravity didn't end there. After committing the unspeakable act, Garavito would often castrate his victims' corpses when consumed by rage and venom. In a grotesque display of dominance, he would place the severed genitals in the mouth of the dead boys. This horrifying ritual was not just an act of violence. It was a sickening signature of his madness. Out of hundreds of victims, only 2 are known to have suffered this fate. After Luis Garavito's murder spree began in 1992, some victims were luckier than others in their escape attempts. One such survivor was 16-year-old Bran Fernie Bernal Alvarez, who worked for his father in a cockfighting business. Garavito approached Alvarez not with charm or deceit, but with immediate violence, threatening him with a knife. He marched the terrified boy into the depths of the forest and bound him with rope, ready to unleash his horrific intentions. In a brutal act of aggression, Garavito stabbed Alvarez 7 times with a screwdriver during a sexual assault. But fate intervened. In a moment of sheer desperation, Alvarez managed to break free from his bindings and fled into the wilderness, narrowly escaping the clutches of death. Garavito's insatiable thirst for violence didn't stop there. In another chilling encounter, he targeted a 10-year-old boy named Carlos Alberto, luring him with promises of 200 pesos, roughly 10 cents in modern U.S. currency. Along with small gifts, Garavito led Carlos to a secluded hillside covered in trees. The usual horrific pattern followed as Garavito prepared to assault the boy. At one point during the ordeal, Garavito asked Carlos if he was enjoying it. Hoping to appease his abductor and perhaps buy himself some time, the frightened boy replied, yes. To Garavito's shocking response, he let Carlos go without killing him, saying, "That's how you like it. That's how I like it. See you next week." This chilling exchange raised questions about how Garavito managed to evade capture despite his monstrous acts. How could he let one person escape and another go free? It seemed almost unbelievable. By 1995, in the town of Armenia, the bodies of countless children began to surface, each one a chilling reminder of the monster lurking in the shadows. The local district attorney's office finally took notice, setting up a 4-man task force to investigate the growing number of unexplained corpses. It was a desperate attempt to bring justice to the families who had lost their children. The task force began requesting reports of similar discoveries from across Colombia, and soon hundreds of reports flooded in. However, many of these children remained unidentified, and the details of their injuries were often vague. This made it nearly impossible for investigators to connect the dots and link these horrific deaths to Garavito's gruesome modus operandi. In that same year, police stumbled upon a horrifying scene: the bodies of 4 children in various states of decomposition found on a hillside in the AR Valley. These children, all from lower-class backgrounds and aged between 8 and 10, had vanished before noon. Disturbingly, 2 of them were cousins who disappeared on the same day while the other 2 were taken on different days. It appeared that once Garavito found a suitable spot for his heinous acts, he would lure subsequent victims there as well, quickly subduing and binding them. The sight of previous corpses would have struck terror into any child unfortunate enough to witness it. The authorities were finally beginning to connect the dots. By 1995, Police discovered several empty bottles of cheap brandy and a bottle of lubricant at the scenes of his crimes. This marked one of the earliest links made by investigators to a killer stalking the region, preying on innocent children. The bodies that were found all bore similar signs of injury, with the same cause of death, a brutal slash across the throat. Garavito's cruelty escalated even further as he added a horrific new method of torture, inserting a knife into the rectums of his victims. DNA evidence collected from the bodies revealed that they had been sexually assaulted, but investigators were left in the dark about whether these acts occurred before or after death. It was known that Garavito usually assaulted his victims while they were alive, but sometimes, if a child expired too soon, he would engage in necrophilia. This chilling revelation only deepened the horror surrounding his already monstrous persona. On June 8, 1996, Luis Garavito was in the town of Boca, where he approached a group of boys in a shop and bought them sweets. With his deceptive charm, he managed to lure one boy away for an odd job, the unsuspecting child following him on his bike. Tragically, the boy's mutilated remains were discovered just 5 days later. At the time, Garavito was still in Boca and was identified by the other boys who had seen him with the victim. However, despite this damning evidence, Garavito was arrested but soon found himself back on the streets. During police interrogation, he admitted to buying the boy sweets, but claimed he had left him alone afterward. How could this be? If someone is arrested for such suspicious behavior, buying sweets for children, shouldn't there be a system in place to keep a watchful eye on them? It seemed outrageous that he could escape justice so easily. After some smooth talking and playing the part of a harmless individual, Garavito managed to convince the police to release him just 4 days later. Almost immediately, he traveled to Pereira, where he wasted no time in continuing his horrific spree by torturing and murdering a 13-year-old boy. In late June, Garavito moved to Seja, where fate led him to cross paths with Luz Mar Ampo Orozco, a woman he had first met back in 1973 while working at a grocery store. Now a school teacher and single mother of a 15-year-old son, Ampo welcomed Garavito into her home. He told her that he was no longer working in grocery stores but had become a street vendor selling air fresheners across Colombia. However, with the school year ending, he complained about being out of work. Garavito began selling fruit from a cart in the marketplace and paid Ampo some money for room and board. But his stay didn't last long. His alcoholism soon took over. Locals began calling him Conflicto because of his frequent drunkenness and aggressive behavior. By the end of July, Ampo was eager to be rid of him, leading Garavito to move out in August 1996. During this time, he briefly stayed with a male friend before returning to Luz Mar Ampo Orozco, the woman he had previously manipulated into letting him stay. Cautiously, she agreed again, but one could only wonder why she would take such a risk. After all, she had kicked him out once before due to his violent behavior and alcoholism. Now he was back, spending his days begging on the streets, unable to work or hunt for new victims. The proceeds from his panhandling went to Ampo as he tried to ingratiate himself once more. By mid-September, after Garavito had recovered somewhat, he bought Ampo a television and paid for it in installments. However, just 2 weeks later, in October, he fell back into his old habits. Drunk once again, Garavito got into a physical altercation with Ampo's teenage son over the television. He wanted to watch the local news while the boy was engrossed in something else. This confrontation led Ampo to kick Garavito out of her home for good. The absurdity of Garavito's behavior was astounding. Here he was, a man with a history of horrific violence and manipulation, trying to impose himself on a household that had already shown him kindness. It was as if he believed he could buy their loyalty with gifts while simultaneously expecting them to bear the burden of his debts. "I bought you a car," he might say with a smirk, "but you have to pay the monthly payments." It was infuriatingly ridiculous, a twisted sense of entitlement wrapped in layers of deceit. 2 months later, on Christmas Day, Luz Mar Ampo Orozco had a male friend visit her, bringing a Christmas present that would spark a terrifying chain of events. Garavito, ever the lurking predator, must have been watching the house because that evening he made a drunken phone call to Ampo, hurling insults at her male friend and calling him a gazer. In response, Ampo firmly told Garavito that he was banned from ever staying with her again. Guess what? It's none of your business. I've kicked you out of my house twice. I was very generous. Don't tell me what I can and cannot do. The tension was palpable. She had to be terrified of what he might do next. At 6 a.m. the following morning, Garavito showed up at Ampo's house, still intoxicated and shouting threats while peppering her with obscene insults. In a fit of rage, he attempted to strangle her. Fearing for their lives, Ampo and her son fled to a neighbor's house for safety. Garavito then trashed Ampo's place, spending several more hours sobering up and writing her an apology note before departing. That would be the last time she ever saw him. Shortly after this incident, in the second week of January 1997, Garavito murdered 3 victims, all between the ages of 6 and 8. In desperate need of a new place to stay, he rekindled his relationship with Graciela Zabalita, a single mother in Pereira with whom he had first formed a romantic connection in 1986. The two had kept in touch over the years, and Garavito sweet-talked her into letting him move in again. He used her home as a base of operations while continuing his horrific spree across the country. Garavito's presence in Pereira allowed him to commit further atrocities. On October 1st, 1997, he murdered 2 boys at a bus terminal. The following month in November, police uncovered a dump site containing 4 victims in a countryside ravine near Pereira, where Garavito was based. This gruesome discovery ignited a media frenzy and triggered a massive police investigation that ultimately stalled due to a lack of suspects. Then, in February 1998, police discovered the bodies of 3 boys lying on a hillside just outside the town of Genova. One of the victims had been so brutally impaled on a pike that the sharp end protruded from his mouth. The sheer horror of this act was reminiscent of Vlad the Impaler himself, an image so grotesque it sent shockwaves through the community. As news stories about other victims being discovered across Colombia flooded the media, Garavito became increasingly alarmed. He followed these reports closely, knowing that each revelation brought law enforcement closer to uncovering his monstrous deeds. By July 1998, Graciela had finally grown tired of Garavito's drunken and abusive behavior. Whenever Luis Garavito was home, Graciela Ampo would politely ask him to leave, and he would depart peaceably. However, he managed to convince her to keep another black cotton bag at her house. Inside that bag were the haunting remnants of his monstrous acts, photos of boys' ID cards and severed toes. How could no one be looking into these bags, questioning the strange contents that hinted at unspeakable horrors? Convinced that he needed to take his murderous activities abroad for a while, Garavito purchased a forged passport under the name Benicio Moreira and flew to Ecuador. For the next 2 months, he begged for money on the streets, but locals quickly marked him as a foreigner due to his heavy Colombian accent. In late July, Garavito struck again, murdering a 14-year-old boy and then a 12-year-old boy in the town of Choni, Ecuador. After these heinous acts, Garavito moved on to the city of Santo Domingo. There, people began complaining to authorities about him lurking around a school, a chilling sight given his history. This school was for girls, raising unsettling questions. Was Garavito branching out in his predatory ways? Was he deliberately modifying his killing pattern? Or was he simply revealing another layer of his disturbing nature? The thought of this monster prowling near innocent children sent shivers down the spine of anyone who heard it. After all, it was entirely possible that Luis Garavito was lurking around boys' schools, but it was only his presence at the girls' school that triggered local alarm. In response, the Santo Domingo police set up a sting operation to catch Garavito in the act of either molestation or abduction. Finally, it seemed like law enforcement was getting its act together in Ecuador. However, Garavito must have caught wind of the operation because he fled the country shortly thereafter. Ecuadorian authorities soon discovered the corpse of a boy and a girl, both killed in Garavito's usual horrific style. It's chilling to think that the girl may have been an intended victim or simply an opportunistic one, having been in the company of the boy when Garavito struck. From Ecuador, Garavito claimed he flew to Venezuela, where he murdered yet another victim before returning to Colombia in late August. Now unwelcome at Graciela's place, Garavito began sleeping rough as he traveled across Colombia. Then, In November 1998, a mass grave containing 36 victims was uncovered. Reports of other killings and mass graves began flooding in from across the country. Finally, a national task force was established to coordinate the investigation. After years of police inaction, the hunt was on, and all one could say was, "It's about time." On the morning of February 6, 1999, Garavito murdered 3 children in a sugarcane field just outside the city of Pala in the Cauca Valley. The usual modus operandi was observed, but this time Garavito was far drunker than usual, if that was even possible. He had stripped off his shorts and underwear and was in the middle of performing an act of necrophilia on one of his victims when he passed out on top of the body. A lit cigarette dangled from his left hand as he lay there. In a cruel twist of fate, the sugarcane around him caught fire from his cigarette. The flames began to scorch his left side, causing second and third degree burns down his arm and leg. When Garavito finally woke up in a panic, he abandoned his glasses, shoes, underwear, shorts, and some money, an absolute treasure trove of forensic evidence, before fleeing the scene. Garavito ran across the countryside with his arms and genitals exposed, hiding from people until he managed to discreetly steal a pair of trousers from a clothesline. He then hitchhiked barefoot and with untreated burns for 190 kilometers, about 120 miles, from Pala to Pereira to put some distance between himself and the now smoldering carnage. One could only hope that the fire had been strong enough to destroy all that evidence he left behind. His glasses and wallet would surely lead investigators straight to him. Arriving in Pereira by early evening, Garavito staggered into a local drugstore to get some basic first aid before disappearing without. Meanwhile, back in Pala, a local farmer had managed to put out the fire and stumbled upon 2 of Garavito's victims in the process. The police discovered the third body the very next day, February 7th, along with the items Garavito had carelessly left behind. The pieces of this terrible puzzle were starting to come together, but would the authorities act quickly enough? As investigators examined the latest victims, they discovered injuries that matched those of countless other children found across the country. The number of bodies had now risen into the triple digits, a chilling testament to the monster that roamed free. Among the evidence left at the scene was money that had been printed and circulated in a town called Eal, located 485 kilometers, about 300 miles, south of Pala, near the Ecuadorian border. This suggested that Garavito traveled widely, just like the serial killer the National Task Force was desperately trying to catch. More crucial were the glasses and shoes he abandoned. The glasses had a left lens specifically designed for someone with a certain type of astigmatism, a condition typically found in people aged 40 to 60. At 42 years old, Garavito fit this profile perfectly. The thought that such a small detail could lead to his capture sent chills down the spines of those who followed the case. It was as if every clue was a step closer to bringing this horrific nightmare to an end. The shoes and glasses were more than just personal items. They were pieces of a puzzle that painted a clearer picture of Garavito's twisted existence. The arms of the glasses found at the scene were bent downward, suggesting that the wearer had unusually placed ears. This peculiar feature had earned Garavito the nickname Goofy among the children in his neighborhood. Meanwhile, the shoes he left behind showed signs of wear that raised eyebrows. There was no erosion at the tip of the shoe, indicating that his foot was smaller than the size of the shoe. More importantly, circular wear patterns on the middle and heel of the right shoe suggested that he walked with a limp, rotating his foot slightly as he moved. Garavito had broken his leg in August 1996, and it had healed poorly, leaving him with a noticeable limp. The footprints found at the scene indicated that he stood between 5 feet 4 inches and 5 feet 6 inches tall, perfectly matching Garavito's height of 5 feet 5 inches. This was a mountain of evidence, but investigators knew that many people could fit this description unless they could find DNA to match him directly. The information was sent to the National Task Force, which began sifting through files on suspects involved in criminal activities. They faced a daunting task. Since 1989, there had been over 5,000 suspects linked to various crimes. Detectives quickly filtered out cases involving female victims because all known victims in Colombia were boys. They had only one girl connected to Garavito's crimes, found in Ecuador. a different country entirely. This process narrowed their list down to 1,500 suspects. Next, they excluded anyone under 40 years old, drastically reducing their pool to just 95 individuals. It was shocking to learn that about 70% of reported sexual crimes in Colombia involved young girls, while an overwhelming 94% of suspects who acted against young boys were under 40. When they focused on height again, filtering for those between 5 feet 4 inches and 5 feet 6 inches, they whittled it down to just 45 names. Finally, detectives concentrated on suspects who had been implicated in sex crimes near areas where mass graves and dump sites had been discovered, particularly around Bogota and the coffee-growing regions. This led them to a list of only 25 names, and among them was Luis Garavito. The names were circulated to local law enforcement across Colombia. Meanwhile, one dedicated investigator named Aldemar Duran took charge of the case involving 3 boys murdered in Garavito's hometown of Genova back in February 1998. Duran worked tirelessly on this case. He barely slept or took breaks, earning him the nickname, the Killer's Shadow, among his colleagues. A fitting title for someone so determined to bring justice. When the investigation exploded into a national crisis in November, Duran quickly matched specific details from other cases. A particular type of rope used for binding victims, cheap brandy bottles left at crime scenes, and similar injuries inflicted on young boys. Since Colombia lacked forensic psychologists experienced with serial killers, Duran reached out to the FBI for guidance on building a profile. He immersed himself in every detail of the dozens of murders, trying to understand what made this killer tick. Duran suspected that Garavito traveled around Colombia like a vagrant, so he placed undercover officers in homeless communities across the country, ignoring jurisdictional boundaries if it meant catching this monster. Shortly after uncovering crucial evidence, Detective Aldemar Duran discovered that Luis Garavito had been arrested for a second time in 1996, this time under suspicion of murdering a victim in the town of Baca. Duran felt a surge of hope. This could be the break they had been waiting for. With only 25 suspects on their list, it seemed like they were closing in on their guy. Why hadn't they collected DNA samples yet? Surely, if they just asked, some would comply. Even if a few refused, eliminating even 10 suspects would bring them closer to catching the monster. Sadly, Garavito was released again, slipping through the cracks just when Duran felt certain he had found the killer the nation was searching for. Determined to track down anyone who knew Garavito, Duran set off for Trio. Meanwhile, the city of Pereira was under intense scrutiny, since it was the first place where police had discovered a mass grave. Officers conducted house-to-house searches but found nothing significant. However, another name on the list of 25 suspects caught Duran's attention: Pedro Pablo Ramirez Garcia. This man had a criminal record related to pederastic activities dating back to 1980. He was 44 years old, stood at 5 feet 6 inches, and walked with a limp in his right leg. It was alarming how similar he was to Garavito, 2 suspects with a limp among just 25 names. What made things even more suspicious was that Pedro was a street vendor selling honey from old bottles of brandy, the same type of cheap brandy found at many crime scenes. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and it looked like Pedro might be guilty as sin. Yet, despite these similarities, Duran knew that catching Garavito would be no easy task. Investigators began filtering through the evidence and suspect lists with urgency. They needed to act fast before this predator struck again. Garcia was already a suspect in the murder of 2 boys found at a bus terminal in Pereira on October 1st, 1997. Those boys had also fallen victim to the monstrous hands of Luis Garavito. To make matters worse, another boy in Pereira identified Garcia as the man who had tried to assault him. This was more than enough for the police to hunt him down and throw him in a cell. Garcia vehemently denied any involvement in the killings, but the police were convinced they had their man. However, just when they thought they were closing in on justice, Garavito struck again, brutally murdering 4 more victims in Bogota. This shocking development troubled the police, but they kept Garcia imprisoned as a precaution, especially since the allegations from the boy in Pereira hadn't been resolved. It became clear that this attempted assault had not been committed by Garavito. Meanwhile, Detective Aldemar Duran was hard at work in Trio. He managed to track down Garavito's sister, Esther, during his investigation. When questioned, Esther revealed that Garavito had left a black cotton bag with her for safekeeping. Duran's heart raced. This could be the evidence they needed. Esther turned over the bag to the police, and inside were documents, receipts, photographs, postcards, and various souvenirs from Garavito's travels between 1992 and 1994. But that wasn't all. Duran also discovered a box of notebooks at Esther's home containing a long list of children's names. Among the papers was a receipt for a money order sent to a woman named Graciela Zabalita who lived in Pereira. Without wasting a moment, Duran rushed to Pereira to interview Graciela. She handed over yet another black cotton bag filled with even more evidence. Documents, receipts, photos, lottery tickets, bus tickets, and newspaper clippings about the killings. However, what sent shivers down Duran's spine were the synthetic fibers from ropes found in this bag that matched those discovered at various murder sites. There were also razor blades with blood on them and bottles of lubricant that matched those found at many crime scenes. The real question on everyone's mind was, where was Luis Garavito? Neither Esther nor Graciela had seen him in months. Graciela's little black bag had led the police to the house Garavito was renting in Pereira, but when they arrived, they found the property completely vacated. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, a ghost slipping through their fingers just when they were closing in on him. Then, in the early evening of April 22, 1999, in the city of Villa Vieja, Garavito struck again. He had been drinking heavily all afternoon, lost in a bottle of brandy when he spotted 12-year-old Juan Sabal selling lottery tickets on the street. Without wasting a moment, Garavito approached the boy with deceitful charm but quickly turned menacing. He threatened Juan with a knife, wrapping his arms around him in a false gesture of affection before dragging him into a taxi. "Keep your mouth shut," he hissed, "or I'll kill you." The taxi took them to the outskirts of town, where Garavito forced Juan to climb over a barbed wire fence. Once on the other side, he ordered Juan to walk until they reached an isolated area at the top of a hill. There, Garavito forced the terrified boy to his knees and tied his hands with rope while taunting him with chilling questions. "Am I a sadist? Am I a sadist? Am I a sadist?" He laughed cruelly at Juan's fear as he waved his knife threateningly. But fate intervened when a 16-year-old homeless boy spotted Garavito and Juan. Recognizing that Juan was in grave danger, the teenager began throwing rocks at Garavito, distracting him just long enough for Juan to seize his chance. With adrenaline pumping through his veins, Juan jumped to his feet and ran towards the older boy as Garavito chased them down, knife drawn and ready for violence. Despite Garavito's determined pursuit, his limp slowed him down. The two boys managed to escape past a local farmhouse where they were spotted by a 12-year-old girl. Seeing Garavito close behind them, she bravely misled him by pointing toward the woods. Confused and frustrated, Garavito took off in that direction while the two boys made their way to a nearby car garage. Once inside, the 16-year-old entrusted Juan to a mechanic working there and quickly left, not wanting to get involved any further. The mechanic called the police at 7:15 p.m., but by that time, Juan had already been reported missing. The police rushed to the garage to bring Juan's mother for identification. As Juan Sabal's mother was brought to the police station to make a statement, a chilling turn of fate unfolded. From the car window, Juan spotted Luis Garavito walking nonchalantly by the side of the road. "There he is," he shouted, pointing with urgency. The police wasted no time. They pulled over and arrested Garavito on the spot. This was it. After so many years of terror, they finally had him in their grasp. Garavito showed no emotion as he identified himself as Benicio Moreira, denying any involvement in Juan's abduction. But the police weren't fooled. They took him down to the station for questioning. As they processed this man claiming to be Moreira, officers noticed something unsettling. His signature was different on every piece of paper he signed. Under questioning, Garavito continued to insist on his false identity, but the evidence was piling up against him. He fit the description of the infamous Pallor killer. 5 feet 5 inches, wearing glasses and limping on his right leg. The National Task Force was alerted, and they quickly realized that Garavito also had burns down his left side, consistent with injuries he might have sustained from a sugarcane fire. It felt like everything was coming together. They were finally closing in on the monster who had haunted Colombia for far too long. As the task force circulated Garavito's mugshot to law enforcement across the country, Detective Aldemar Duran recognized him immediately. This was Luis Alfredo Garavito, but Garavito stubbornly denied it, continuing to identify himself as Morera. He was detained at La Tramacua, a notorious maximum security prison in Valledupar, charged with the kidnapping, sexual assault, and attempted murder of Juan Sabal. Meanwhile, Duran was relentless in his pursuit of justice. He tracked down one of Garavito's platonic female friends, Maria Umar Toro, and convinced her to visit him in prison while wearing a wire. During their conversation, Garavito casually mentioned a black bag filled with documents that he had instructed another prisoner's wife to retrieve during her visit. Duran acted quickly. Police located the woman and seized the bag, uncovering a treasure trove of evidence. Receipts, bus tickets, photographs of children, each item sending shivers down their spines. Among these papers was a chilling tally of victims for that year, a grim record that would haunt everyone involved in the case. They arranged for him to have an eye exam to confirm that he had astigmatism in his left eye, which matched the lens of the charred glasses found in the sugarcane field in Palmyra. To avoid raising Garavito's suspicions and prompting him to cheat on the test, investigators cleverly decided to have every inmate in the prison take the same eye test while Garavito was out of his cell. As the officers worked behind the scenes, they seized the opportunity to collect hair samples and DNA from Garavito, knowing that this could be the key to locking him down for good. The anticipation was electric. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The eye test was just one piece of the puzzle, but with enough circumstantial evidence already stacked against him, they were ready to confirm his guilt once and for all. When the results came back, it was a perfect match for both the hair and DNA found at multiple crime scenes. The police then used all the evidence collected from Garavito's black bags, along with police records and independent sources, to compile a detailed history of his movements since 1992. It was a painstaking process that took weeks, but what they uncovered sent chills down their spines. Wherever there was a record of Garavito's location over the past 7 years, there were murders. From late April to early July of 1999, everything came to a head. The police decided it was time to confront Garavito with this overwhelming evidence in hopes of extracting a confession. On July 2nd, they subjected him to an intense 9 hours of questioning. But Garavito denied everything, even his true identity. That's when Detective Aldemar Duran, known as the Killer's Shadow, stepped in. He had spent years studying Garavito's case and understood the killer's psychology intimately. Duran sat with Garavito for an astonishing 18 hours of questioning, meticulously going over every scrap of information and piece of evidence. He forced Garavito to relive the gruesome details of dozens of killings, pushing him into a corner where he could no longer hide from his monstrous actions. As Duran recounted each horrific scene in vivid detail, Garavito's facade began to crack. The arousal he once felt morphed into anger and shame as he broke down in tears, screaming, "Why? Why?" at the top of his lungs. In those early hours of July 4th, something shifted within him. He began confessing to the murder of dozens of children across Colombia between 1992 and 1999, providing dates and locations with chilling clarity. Initially, he admitted to killing 140 children, but everyone knew this was just scratching the surface. The true horror lay in the countless lives lost at his hands. Lives that would never see justice if he continued to evade full accountability. Despite years of police inaction and disorganization, it was a clever bit of policing that finally brought Luis Garavito to justice. Much of the credit went to Detective Aldemar Duran, who not only identified him but also extracted a confession that would send shockwaves through Colombia. The forensic analysts played a crucial role as well, piecing together the evidence left behind in the sugarcane field in Palmyra. The National Task Force coordinated effectively with local law enforcement and imported experts and cutting-edge technologies from America, the UK, the Netherlands, and Russia to crack the case wide open. But here's where the justice system began to fail the grieving mothers and fathers of Colombia. In 2001, Garavito went to trial charged with killing 172 children, but he was ultimately convicted of only 138. Neither of these numbers comes close to the total we now suspect he actually killed. He was sentenced to an astonishing 1,853 years and 9 days in prison. However, due to a constitutional constraint in Colombia, prisoners could only serve a maximum of 40 years for such sentences. Garavito's cooperation with authorities, helping them locate more bodies, and his good behavior while incarcerated meant that his sentence was ultimately reduced to just 22 years. For perspective, this meant that Garavito received roughly 2 months of imprisonment for each of the 138 children he was convicted of murdering. Even more shocking, for every child he is estimated to have actually killed, he served only about 3 weeks in prison. When considering the additional victims he sexually assaulted and tortured but did not kill between 1972 and 1992, it boiled down to roughly 10 days in prison for each victim. The outrage over this sentence echoed throughout Colombia. How could a man responsible for such unspeakable horrors be given such leniency? The nation was left grappling with the reality that Garavito might one day walk free after only a fraction of his sentence had been served. The pain and suffering he inflicted on countless innocent lives seemed almost trivialized by the very system meant to protect them. In the early hours of February 16, 1997, the Captain D's fast food restaurant in Nashville, Tennessee, became the setting for a harrowing crime. 2 employees, Steve Hampton and Sarah Jackson, were preparing for the day when a man named Paul Reed approached under the guise of seeking employment. Trusting his story, they allowed him inside, unknowingly sealing their fate. Once inside, Reed revealed his sinister intentions. He brandished a handgun, forced Steve and Sarah into the walk-in cooler, and executed them with cold precision, shooting them in the back of the head. After the murders, Reed stole approximately $7,000 from the restaurant and an additional $600 from Steve's wallet. He also removed the surveillance camera recordings to eliminate evidence of his crime. The investigation into these murders revealed shoe prints at the crime scene but no fingerprints, complicating efforts to identify Reed initially. Employees recalled a man who had come to apply for a cooking position just days prior but had been told to return later when the manager would be available. This detail would later become crucial as investigators pieced together Reed's movements leading up to this tragic event. The shocking violence at Captain D's marked only the beginning of Paul Reed's violent spree, which would claim more innocent lives in subsequent weeks. Paul Dennis Reed, infamously known as the fast food killer, was an American serial killer convicted of 7 murders during 3 fast food restaurant robberies in Tennessee between February and April 1997. His crimes terrorized the Nashville and Clarksville communities, leaving a lasting impact on the state. Paul was born on November 12, 1957, in Richland Hills, Texas, a small town just outside Fort Worth. Back then, this quiet place was changing from farmland into a busy neighborhood because of new factories that had sprung up during World War II. Many families moved there looking for better opportunities, including Paul's family. From the very beginning, Paul faced tough challenges. He was born with a deformed ear that made it hard for him to hear. He had 2 older sisters, Linda and Janet. For the first few years of his life, they lived together with their parents. But when Paul was just 3 years old, everything changed. His parents got divorced because his father was abusive, and his mother wanted to find a safer life for her children. This meant that Paul and his sister Janet stayed with their father and grandmother while Linda went to live with their mother. As he grew up, Paul had dreams of becoming a country music star. But instead of chasing that dream, he chose a much darker path that led him to commit terrible acts. In just 60 days, he would become known as one of America's mass murderers. Paul's father was a man shrouded in mystery. He worked as a private investigator and repossessed cars, but he was often away from home and struggled with alcoholism. Because of this, Paul and his sister Janet spent most of their time with their grandmother. Sadly, she didn't know how to discipline them properly, which allowed Paul to get into all sorts of trouble from a very young age. By the time he was not even 5 years old, Paul was already stealing mail from neighbors and taking clothes off their lines. He played cruel pranks, like putting thumbtacks in his grandmother's soup. It was hard to believe that she could still love him after such mean tricks. But things took an even darker turn when he barricaded her in her room and set fire to her bed while she was inside. Miraculously, she survived, but it's shocking to think how a child could act so dangerously without facing serious consequences. As time went on, Paul's behavior spiraled further out of control. In a heartbreaking act that showed just how troubled he really was, he took his grandmother's dog and beat it to death with a baseball bat. This terrible incident revealed the darkness growing inside him. When Paul turned 5, he suffered a severe head injury after a brick fell on him while he was playing at a construction site. Some people said it was just an accident, but others wondered if there was more to it. Paul didn't start school until he was about 7 years old. His father finally decided it was time for him to go, but adjusting to school was a big challenge for Paul. The school psychologist discovered that he had some kind of brain dysfunction, which explained his poor judgment and inappropriate behavior in class. At 8 years old, Paul was sent to a Catholic all-boys school in Houston, Texas. This school later became known for taking in neglected children. Despite the new environment, Paul continued to struggle with his emotions and actions. When Paul turned 14, he faced another serious head injury. While riding his mini bike, he got into an accident and fractured his skull. He spent some time in the hospital, and it seemed like he had narrowly escaped a worse fate. But soon after, while riding again, a car struck him. He flew off his bike and hit his head on the windshield, suffering yet another traumatic injury. As time passed, Paul's father grew more and more frustrated with his son's behavior. At one point, he even tried to put Paul up for adoption. This left Paul feeling abandoned and alone until his mother stepped in and brought him to live with her and his sister. However, things didn't get better. When Paul was 16, his mother kicked him out of the house after he attempted to assault her and also tried to sexually assault his sister. By the time he turned 18, he already had a juvenile record filled with trouble, including auto theft, forging checks, and assault. His early years were marked by bad choices that set a dark tone for his future. In the early 1980s, Paul got married in his early 20s. Not much is known about his wife, but it seems she may have left him after discovering more about his troubled past. Paul's sister had warned her not to marry him, but sometimes love can blind us to the truth. Even while married, Paul continued to act recklessly. He was charged with aggravated robbery but managed to avoid prison because he was deemed incompetent to stand trial. This meant that authorities believed he wasn't of sound mind. While still married, Paul stole city equipment to start his own business. When he got caught, he was arrested and awaited trial. Before the trial began, there were hearings to determine if Paul was competent to stand trial. During these hearings, Paul put on quite a show. He fell backward in his chair in front of everyone, shot paper into the air with a rubber band, and even made a paper hat that he placed on his lawyer's head. His silly antics seemed aimed at convincing everyone that he wasn't mentally stable. However, the judge and prosecutor were not fooled by his performance. They noticed that Paul acted completely normal when the jury was not present. This led them to believe he was trying to manipulate the system. In the end, Paul was convicted of aggravated robbery and received a 20-year prison sentence. However, he only served 7 years before being released on parole. It's a shame because, looking back, jail might have been good for Paul. Perhaps it would have been best if he had stayed there, especially knowing what was to come. While he was locked up, Paul's wife decided to divorce him. He spent time in a Texas prison, and during that time he became increasingly paranoid. He developed strange beliefs, thinking that a secret government organization was watching him and controlling his mind. He called this mysterious group Scientific Technology, a name that felt both vague and unsettling. After his release, Paul wrote letters to the Texas governor and even the Washington Post, claiming he had been under government surveillance since 1985. People began to notice that something was seriously wrong with him. Once out of prison, Paul had the chance to change his life. But in 1990, he found himself in another car accident that left him with a concussion and caused him to lose consciousness. It's easy to brush off a concussion, but it's important to take such injuries seriously. As Paul got older, his erratic behavior only worsened. In May 1997, he attended his father's funeral. However, his choice of clothing raised eyebrows. He showed up wearing a bright lime green shirt and shorts with tennis shoes. While some might find that acceptable for casual outings, he topped off his outfit by wearing a Burger King crown on his head and calling himself King Paul. Those who attended were confused and concerned. They wondered why he was acting this way, especially at such a serious moment. But Paul wouldn't change his behavior. He declared loudly, "This is who I am. Live with it. I'm King Paul, and I wear lime green." As if that wasn't enough, Paul had a terrible temper. He was impulsive and often angry, which made many people afraid of him, including his own family members. In 1994, Paul somehow found a girlfriend, and they began living together. She later described their life as walking on eggshells, never knowing what mood he would be in. One night, everything changed. Paul completely lost control. He picked up her cat and threw it across the room. His girlfriend was terrified. In a fit of rage, he threw her onto the couch, got on top of her, and held a pillow over her head. She thought she was going to die as she pleaded for him to stop. At the last moment, he finally let go, leaving her shaken and scared. Paul's sister Linda was also afraid of him. Growing up, he often threatened to kill her. There were serious accusations against him, including sexual assault. His other sister, Janet, later testified in court against him, revealing that he had also assaulted her and threatened her with a knife to keep her silent. People didn't enjoy being around Paul, and he felt it. In response to their discomfort, he declared, "You know what? I'm going to Nashville to become a country musician." He was determined that this would work out for him, even though there was little in his past to suggest a love for country music or guitar playing. But everyone has dreams, and Paul was ready to chase his. Once he arrived in Nashville, reality set in. While he wanted to be famous, he still needed to pay the bills. So he took a job as a dishwasher at Shoney's, an American diner. Paul got along with the other employees and shared some of his ideas with them. He even mentioned the possibility of robbing a fast food restaurant at night when there would be no witnesses. His $100 a week salary just wasn't enough. It's unclear how the other employees reacted to his suggestion, but it lingered in Paul's mind. He decided he didn't need anyone else's help to carry out his plan. So, King Paul went to a pawn shop and bought a .32 caliber revolver. A few months later, he returned to purchase 2.25 caliber automatic handguns. The seller was surprised and asked, "Didn't you just buy a gun?" Paul replied casually that he didn't like how the first one shot and wanted these instead. But he still kept all three guns. In February 1997, while working his shift at Shoney's, Paul lost his temper over something trivial and threw a dish at a fellow employee. This outburst led to his firing, and he was not just angry, he was raging. Feeling desperate after losing his job, Paul thought to himself, "I need to do something about this." He believed he had the motivation and the weapons to set the stage for the crimes that would soon make headlines across the nation. After being fired, he began to spiral into a darker place. Running low on money, Paul drove to Captain D's, a fast food restaurant chain in Tennessee. He arrived just before closing time and entered through the exit door. Inside, he found some workers and casually asked if they were hiring. They told him, "We're closing now. Come back tomorrow afternoon." Paul simply left, but he had other plans. The next morning, February 16th, he returned before Captain D's even opened. It was around 8:50 a.m. when he started banging on the door, knowing people were inside. The manager, Steve Hampton, came out to see what was going on. Although we don't know exactly what they talked about, Paul somehow convinced Steve to let him into the restaurant. An eyewitness later reported that she saw Paul and Steve outside together. Paul was holding a white piece of paper that looked like a resume. Once inside, things took a dark turn. Paul secured the door and pulled out his gun, showing it to Steve and a 16-year-old morning shift employee named Sarah Jackson. With the gun pointed at them, Paul demanded that both of them get into the restaurant's walk-in cooler. Once Paul had Steve and Sarah in the cooler, he forced them to lie face down on the floor. In a shocking act of violence, he shot them multiple times, killing both without any reason. He didn't even know these people. With their lives taken, Paul moved to the cash register and stole $7,000, a significant amount for a single robbery. He then rifled through Steve's wallet, finding an additional $600, which was sadly Steve's rent money. Around 10 a.m., an employee arrived for work but found the doors locked. Unable to get in, he called another Captain D's location but received no answer. Concerned, he contacted another employee whose father was a police officer. When they arrived with the assistant manager, they entered the restaurant and discovered the horrific scene. Steve and Sarah were dead in the cooler, both shot with a .32 caliber revolver. On that same afternoon, about 11 miles away on Ellington Parkway Highway, a man collecting cans for recycling stumbled upon an ID belonging to Steve Hampton's children. Thinking something might be wrong, he called the police. The next day, February 17th, officers searched the highway and found Steve's driver's license, credit card, movie rental card, and birth certificate scattered about. 3 days after the murders at Captain D's, Paul visited a car dealership and paid $2,000 in cash for a prepaid lease on a car. The salesman recognized Paul from previous visits when he had expressed interest in buying a car, but didn't have the money at the time. Now seeing Paul with cash in hand, the salesman was puzzled and asked, "Where did you get this money? Didn't you just say you couldn't afford it?" Paul, now with a new car, lied to the salesman, saying, "Oh, I've been saving up. My dad is helping me." In reality, he was not telling the truth, but cash is cash, and the salesman sold him the car. With this vehicle, Paul felt he could move about freely. Things were already dark in Paul's life, but he decided to double down on his rampage. On March 23, 1997, just 5 weeks after the Captain D's murders, Paul sat in his car at a McDonald's about 3 miles northeast of the restaurant. He waited until closing time at midnight, watching for the employees to exit through the back. When he saw 2 employees taking out the garbage, he got out of his car and ambushed them at gunpoint. He forced them back into the restaurant. Inside, there was a 3rd employee who was completely caught off guard. Without hesitation, Paul shot all 3 of them. The victims were 17-year-old Andrea Brown, 27-year-old Ronald Santiago, and 23-year-old Robert Swell. Tragically, all 3 died from their wounds. They were just trying to earn a paycheck when someone came in and took their lives. There was a 4th employee inside who had been laying low to avoid detection. When Paul spotted him and attempted to shoot, his gun jammed. This gave Jose Gonzalez a chance to fight back. In the struggle, Paul pulled out a knife and stabbed Jose 17 times before leaving him for dead. Afterward, Paul went to the cash registers and the safe, stealing a total of $3,000 before fleeing the scene. Miraculously, Jose managed to get up despite his injuries and called 911. The dispatcher struggled to understand him but sent police and paramedics to the restaurant. When they arrived, they found all of the victims and Jose barely alive. They also discovered evidence like fibers that would need to be processed later. Police discovered 6.25 caliber cartridge casings at the scene. They now had evidence of the type of weapon used, but they were still left without leads. The murders seemed random, leaving everyone confused about who could be behind such violence. On April 23, 1997, just a month later, Paul drove to a Baskin-Robbins in Clarksville, Tennessee. He arrived around 10 p.m. When he got there, he tried to convince the 2 employees, Angela Holmes, 21, and Michelle Mace, 16, to let him inside. The shop was already closed, and they told him, "Sorry, sir, you'll have to come back tomorrow." However, Paul was persuasive and somehow managed to convince them to let him in. Once inside, Paul pulled out his gun and demanded money from the cash register and the safe. But instead of killing Angela and Michelle like he had with his previous victims, he forced both of them into his car. They were now in a terrifying situation with no easy way out. Hopefully, you never have to use this information, but it's worth mentioning. Michelle, one of the employees at Baskin-Robbins, had a brother who would pick her up after her night shifts. He usually arrived around 10:10 p.m., just minutes after Paul had forced Michelle and Angela into his car. As he waited outside, he noticed that Angela's car was still in the parking lot. This led him to believe that both women were still working. He saw the store lights on but peered inside and found it empty. Sensing that something was wrong, he called 911. When the police arrived, they discovered that the cash register was empty and the top of the safe had been removed along with its contents. What caught their attention was that Angela's and Michelle's purses were still inside the store, untouched. This seemed odd for a robbery. Tragically, the next morning, Angela and Michelle's bodies were found at Dunbar Cave State Natural Area, a park about 3 miles from Baskin-Robbins. They had been discovered in a gruesome state, with stab wounds covering their bodies. Paul never forgot how he was fired from Shoney's and held a deep resentment toward his former manager, Mitchell Roberts. On June 12, 1997, he decided to confront Mitchell at his home. Paul knocked on the door and greeted him casually. "Hey, remember me?" Mitchell had no idea that Paul was armed with a knife and a gun. At first, Paul pretended to be interested in getting rehired, trying to convince Mitchell that maybe he could help him out. But in reality, Paul had darker intentions. He wanted to kidnap Mitchell. As Paul stood at the door, he noticed Mitchell's son playing with a camcorder, recording everything. Paul thought quickly and decided to change his plan. He waved at the camera and said, "All right, I'll see you later," before leaving the house. Mitchell felt uneasy after the encounter. Something about Paul's behavior was off and creepy. Once Paul was gone, he picked up the phone and called the police. "Hello? There's a weirdo out here," he explained, trying to convey his concern. At that time, police were already on high alert, monitoring local fast food restaurants. They had noticed a disturbing pattern of robberies and murders and were anticipating that the killer would strike again. Though they didn't know who was responsible for these crimes, they believed it had to be the same person. They had also learned from Jose Gonzalez, the survivor of the McDonald's attack, that there was only one perpetrator. After receiving Mitchell's call, officers went to Paul's house to arrest him. They booked him, took his fingerprints, and photographed him. It was during this process that they discovered Paul's thumbprint matched perfectly with a print found on Steve Hampton's movie rental card, the same card discovered by the recycler. Now that they had a photo of Paul, they showed it to Jose Gonzalez. Without hesitation, Jose identified him, saying, "Yes, that is the guy." Paul was also positively identified by 2 other employees who had been working at Captain D's restaurant. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together as law enforcement closed in on a suspect in a series of terrifying crimes that had shaken the community to its core. Remember when Paul first visited Captain D's and asked, "Hey, are you guys hiring?" The employees had told him to come back later. Now, those same employees were identifying him as the man who had attacked them. If that wasn't enough, police discovered that Paul's shoe size matched the footprints left behind at the Captain D's scene. Additionally, they found DNA from the Baskin-Robbins victims on his shoes. The evidence continued to pile up. Fibers from Paul's car matched those found on the bodies of the Baskin-Robbins victims. It was clear they had found their suspect. Paul was charged with 7 counts of first-degree murder. However, things got complicated because there would be 3 separate trials. Each attack and murder had occurred in different counties, so the legal process required going through each one. The first trials were set for 1999 for the Captain D's and Baskin-Robbins murders, followed by a trial in 2000 for the McDonald's murders. The evidence against Paul was overwhelming. In the McDonald's case, Jose Gonzalez testified in court, identifying Paul as the attacker and recounting every gruesome detail of that night. In the Baskin-Robbins trial, prosecutors presented DNA evidence found on Paul's shoes, and they also noted that the knife used in those murders matched one that Mitchell Roberts had seen Paul carrying when he came to his house. Despite this evidence, Paul pleaded not guilty in all 3 cases. Before the trials began, his defense raised questions about his mental competence, citing his brain damage and earlier psychological diagnoses. However, this defense was not permitted in court. In the first trial for the Captain D's murders, Paul was sentenced to death twice, once for each murder, and received an additional 25 years in prison for aggravated robbery. Before the next trial, which was for the Baskin-Robbins case, Paul claimed that he was not competent to stand trial, insisting that something was off with him. In response, the state sent an independent psychiatrist to evaluate him. While I can't say what the evaluation process involves, the psychiatrist determined that Paul was indeed competent to stand trial. This meant the legal proceedings could move forward. The jury ultimately found Paul guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of aggravated kidnapping, and 1 count of especially aggravated robbery. I was curious about what especially aggravated robbery meant, so I looked it up. It's a legal term used to describe a more severe form of robbery. As a result of these convictions, Paul was sentenced to death for each of the first-degree murder charges. Things were not looking good for him. It was hard to understand what he thought would happen. Did he really believe he could murder innocent people and just continue living his life without consequences? In the McDonald's case, Paul underwent another extensive pretrial hearing to determine his competence once again. Once again, he was found competent to stand trial. He was tried and found guilty, receiving a death sentence for 3 counts of premeditated murder, 3 counts of felony murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and 1 count of especially aggravated robbery. It seemed like it was all over for Paul. Scheduled for execution on April 29, 2003, Paul wrote a letter on April 14 to the governor and others, stating that he did not intend to pursue any remedies to stop his execution, essentially accepting his fate. However, Paul's sister Janet, who turned out to be a lawyer, stepped in. Good for her. She submitted something called a Next Friend petition, raising questions about Paul's competence once again. The legal battle continued as the story unfolded further. The federal appeals court accepted Janet's petition and ordered a stay of execution on April 28th, just 1 day before Paul was scheduled to be executed. She was trying to help him, hoping to show that he was not well. For the next 10 years, Paul's case bounced from one court to another, undergoing numerous competency hearings. This was partly because Paul refused to pursue the post-conviction appeal initiated by his sister and lawyer. They argued that his resistance to the process proved he was incompetent. If he were truly capable, he wouldn't be fighting against it. I often wondered why they were so determined to save him. If a family member had killed a bunch of innocent people, wouldn't it be time to accept the consequences? I tried not to judge too harshly, recognizing that Janet was fighting for her family against an abusive brother. In October 2012, the Supreme Court of Tennessee finally settled the case, upholding Paul's death sentences. They found that the petitions on his behalf failed to demonstrate his incompetence. The court acknowledged that while Paul had suffered head trauma, he should still be held accountable for his actions. Everyone agreed on this point except for his sister. Before a new execution date could be set, Paul Reed died on November 1, 2013, just 11 days shy of his 56th birthday. He passed away in a Nashville hospital from heart failure due to complications from pneumonia and respiratory illness. The big question remained: was he sane or insane? In its 2012 ruling, the Tennessee Supreme Court referred to Paul Reed as a human conundrum. They found that he was undeniably brain damaged and delusional. Paul believed he was constantly being monitored by the government, convinced that they were trying to control his mind remotely. He insisted that all his trials were mock trials and that his lawyers were merely actors controlled by something he called scientific technology. The complexities of his mind added another layer to a tragic story marked by violence and loss. The court found that Paul had told several mental health professionals over the years that he faked his mental health problems and any delusions to avoid prosecution. This raised a crucial question. Was Paul a mentally ill person trying to appear sane? Or was he a sane person attempting to appear mentally ill? During his court trials and appeal hearings, many mental health professionals testified for both the prosecution and the defense, but they struggled to reach a consensus. There was no doubt that Paul had significant mental issues. A PET scan conducted in 1998 revealed that the left side of Paul's brain was atrophied or dysfunctional. A clinical neuropsychologist who interviewed Paul extensively in 1998 and 1999 determined that his brain damage led to significant mental and behavioral disorders. She testified in court that Paul had exhibited signs of psychosis since at least 1978 and began experiencing delusions in the mid-1980s. She reviewed his childhood records and found that Paul had an IQ in the 80s, which is considered quite low. It was believed that he met the criteria for antisocial personality disorder. But that wasn't all. A licensed speech and language pathologist evaluated Paul in 1999 and testified that he suffered from speech and language problems, which can be characteristic of individuals with traumatic brain injuries. With so many evaluations conducted, none of the experts could agree on a clear diagnosis. A clinical psychologist from Columbia University interviewed Paul for over 20 hours, spoke with his mother and sisters, and reviewed his records. This psychologist concluded that Paul had suffered from paranoid schizophrenia for at least 20 years. However, throughout those 20 years, Paul also displayed rational behavior, which added to the confusion surrounding his case. It seemed possible to be both rational and mentally impaired at the same time, but for many, the situation felt black and white. Before the murders, Paul had enrolled in a community college where he earned straight A's in nearly all of his classes. In 1984, after his court appearance, remember when he made that hat? He even wrote a letter to the state prosecutor apologizing for his courtroom behavior and asking for a shorter sentence. This indicated that he was aware of his actions and their consequences. Mental health professionals who testified for the prosecution agreed that Paul's brain was indeed damaged, but they disagreed that this could lead to schizophrenia or justify his premeditated murders. The experts couldn't reach a consensus on his behavior, leaving them perplexed. When we think of a serial killer, we usually picture someone scary, not an elderly lady. But in 2015, that image was turned upside down when 68-year-old Tamara Samsonova was arrested for some truly terrible crimes. It all started in late July 2015 when Tamara, who used to work at a hotel, was accused of killing 79-year-old Valentina Nikolaevna Ulanova. Tamara had been taking care of Valentina, but things took a dark turn. After the murder, she used a hacksaw to cut Valentina's body into pieces and then dumped it near a pond behind her apartment. Security cameras caught Tamara dragging a big black garbage bag out of her home, and inside was the body of Valentina. But that wasn't all. After her arrest, police found out that Tamara was also suspected of murdering another man back in 2003. This man was a 44-year-old lodger who had lived with her. When they searched her apartment, they discovered his business card. Tamara admitted to killing him during a fight, and his body had been found years earlier in almost the same spot as Valentina's. In her diary, she wrote chillingly about how she cut him into pieces in the bathroom. I killed my tenant Volodya, cut him into pieces in the bathroom with a knife, put the pieces of his body in plastic bags and then threw them away, and threw the bags away. Tamara became known as the Granny Ripper, and as more details came out, people were horrified by what they learned. She had been seen making several trips carrying bags filled with body parts. Her confessions revealed that she might have killed even more people than just Valentina and the lodger. Today, we dive into the twisted mind of Tamara Samsonova. What could have pushed her to commit such awful acts? How did she manage to fool everyone for so long? Tamara was born on April 25, 1947, in a small town called Uzur in central Russia. It was a place where about 20,000 people lived, but not much is known about her early years. After finishing high school, she traveled far away to Moscow for college. There, she studied languages at Moscow State Linguistic University and began to enjoy life in the big city. As Tamara settled into her new life, she seemed just like any other student. But deep inside her was a mind that could think of terrible things. After finishing college, Tamara moved to Leningrad, a bustling city that would later become known as St. Petersburg. It was the early 1970s, and the city was alive with nearly 4 million people. Among the crowd, she met a man named Alexei, not the famous inventor of Tetris, but someone who would change her life forever. Tamara and Alexei quickly fell in love and soon got married. They settled into a newly built panel house in the KCH China area. These panel houses were simple buildings that popped up all over the Soviet Union after World War II to help house the growing population. Tamara found a job as a travel agent, using her degree in languages. She was friendly and spoke several languages, which made her popular with her clients. Her skills helped her land a position at the Grand Hotel Europe, a fancy place that welcomed many foreign visitors. Tamara thrived there, working for 16 years before she finally retired. After she retired, not much was known about Tamara's life until something strange happened. Her husband Alexei suddenly disappeared. They had been together for about 30 years, and then he vanished without a trace. Worried, Tamara went to the police to report him missing. She told them she thought he might have run off with another woman. Because of her explanation, The police didn't rush to search for Alexei. It seemed more like a marital problem than anything serious. They noted her report but didn't investigate deeply, believing it was just a case of a husband leaving his wife. Little did they know this was only the start of a dark story that would unfold in Tamara's life. With Alexei gone, Tamara decided to rent out a room in her apartment to earn some extra money. However, she struggled to keep her roommates for long. Neighbors later remembered that living with Tamara was tough. She often caused loud disturbances. They reported hearing banging on the radiator, yelling, and other unsettling noises coming from her apartment. New roommates would quickly pack their bags and leave, while neighbors watched with suspicion, betting on how long each one would last. Tamara didn't just vent her frustrations. She also kept detailed diaries. For years, she wrote in Russian, English, and sometimes German, filling the pages with her thoughts and daily life. Her entries included boring details about sleepless nights, sipping coffee, and taking medicine. But Tamara had many interests beyond her daily routine. She loved writing songs and had a collection of books about black magic and astrology. As time went on, in 2014, Tamara decided it was time to renovate her apartment. This was perfect timing because she had just met a 79-year-old woman named Valentina Nikolaevna. Valentina was looking for someone to move in and help with chores around the house. At 68 years old, Tamara offered Valentina a place to stay during the renovations in exchange for help with household tasks. This arrangement seemed great for both women. Tamara welcomed Valentina into her home, thinking it would be a perfect setup while her apartment was being fixed up. Tamara enjoyed living at Valentina's place, but sadly, Valentina did not feel the same way. As time passed, their relationship turned sour. Eventually, Valentina asked Tamara to move out, but Tamara firmly refused. "That's crazy," she insisted, her voice rising. Valentina expressed her frustration, saying she was tired of Tamara not keeping up with the housework. To Valentina, it felt like Tamara was just squatting in her home. Despite Valentina's pleas for her to leave, Tamara remained stubborn. In July 2015, their tension boiled over into a fierce argument about unwashed dishes. It was a common problem. Neither woman wanted to tackle the chore. Ironically, Tamara had moved in to help with housework, but was failing to keep her promise. Instead of moving out as requested, Tamara decided that Valentina had become a problem that needed to be solved. In a shocking twist, she resolved to poison Valentina. Later, Tamara claimed she panicked because she felt unsafe living with her. She thought that if Valentina were gone, she could enjoy peace in the apartment for the next 5 months until the renovations were complete. The argument over dirty dishes pushed Tamara over the edge. Determined to act, she drove to a nearby city and convinced a pharmacist to sell her a prescription drug called Phazin. This medication was known for its calming effects and was originally developed in Russia to treat insomnia and anxiety. The pharmacist handed over 50 pills without suspicion. Once back at Valentina's apartment, Tamara cooked one of Valentina's favorite meals, an Olivier salad, a traditional Russian dish made with peas, potatoes, carrots, onions, pickles, eggs, and some kind of meat, all mixed together with mayonnaise. It was the perfect meal to hide her dark plan. Carefully, Tamara crushed all 50 pills and mixed them into the salad before serving it to Valentina, who had no idea what was about to happen. After giving Valentina her food, Tamara went to bed, anxiously waiting for the pills to take effect. Around 2 a.m., she woke up and headed to the kitchen. To her horror, she found Valentina's body lying on the kitchen floor. Reports differ on whether Valentina was still alive when Tamara discovered her. But either way, Tamara's next actions were chilling. In a moment of panic and desperation, Tamara decided to dismember Valentina. She later told police that she chose to do this in the kitchen because Valentina was too heavy to carry into the bathroom. The details of what happened next are unclear, but it is known that Tamara wrapped Valentina's body parts in pieces of a shower curtain and placed them into plastic bags. Afterward, she disposed of the bags in a pond near her neighborhood. CCTV footage captured Tamara dragging plastic bags to the pond on 7 different occasions. 3 days later, on July 26, 2015, a couple was out walking their dog by the pond. enjoying a peaceful afternoon. Suddenly, their dog became very interested in a bag that had washed ashore. Curious, the couple decided to open it, only to be met with a horrifying sight: a headless and limbless torso. Shocked and horrified, they immediately called the police. Unbeknownst to them, on the night of Valentina's murder, someone had already alerted the authorities after seeing Tamara near the pond, dropping bags into the water. The police were starting to piece together a troubling picture. To make matters worse for Tamara, a social worker had stopped by to check on Valentina but was refused entry into the apartment. All these clues were beginning to point in one direction. When police arrived in the neighborhood to ask questions, they discovered that no one had seen Valentina for days. They quickly made their way to the pond to collect the bags and investigate further. Just one day after finding the body parts, they confirmed that they belonged to Valentina. The police then returned to Valentina's apartment and knocked on the door. Tamara answered, welcoming them inside with an unsettling cheerfulness. "Come on in. Don't be shy," she said, as if nothing was wrong. Once inside, the officers began their search. They soon found traces of blood in both the kitchen and bathroom. Then they noticed something odd. The shower curtain had been torn off. This raised suspicions among the investigators. They confronted Tamara directly, asking her about the strange circumstances surrounding her living situation and the unsettling evidence they had uncovered. "Listen, there's blood. There's evidence. Plus, no one has seen Valentina in days," the police told Tamara, their voices firm but calm. Without hesitation, Tamara replied, "Okay, you got me." She didn't even try to deny it. This confession made things easier for everyone involved. The officers arrested her and took her into custody. Once there, Tamara recounted the entire argument over the dishes, a story that must have sounded absurd to the detectives. She explained how she had bought the drugs at the pharmacy and mixed all 50 pills into Valentina's salad. As the investigation continued, police searched Valentina's apartment and discovered Tamara's diary. It was a treasure trove of information for the investigators, even though it was written in 3 different languages. They quickly deciphered her entries and found much more than songs and poetry. They uncovered handwritten confessions to several other murders. Tamara had been very busy indeed. Her diary revealed that she had killed some of her former roommates, whom she described as annoying. One entry detailed how she had dismembered a tenant named Vadim in the bathroom, placing his body parts into plastic bags and disposing of them in different districts. Another chilling entry described how she had done the same to a 44-year-old man named Sergey. According to her entries, she and Sergey had an argument that escalated into murder. In a fit of rage, she dismembered his body and placed the parts into different plastic bags, which she then dumped around the neighborhood. Investigators soon discovered that in 2003, a headless, armless, and legless body had been found on the same street Tamara mentioned in her diary. This case had gone unsolved until now. The connection deepened when Tamara described Sergey's tattoos in her writings, providing investigators with crucial evidence. They realized they didn't need to conduct extensive investigations. All the answers were laid out in her diary. After her arrest, police found Sergey's business card and traces of his blood in Tamara's apartment, further solidifying their case against her. In her diary, she wrote about how much she loved Valentina, but that relationship had ended tragically. Some entries hinted at something even more disturbing. Tamara suggested that she had eaten parts of her victims, including their lungs, legs, and pieces of their heads. This raised unsettling questions. Was she cooking some kind of soup? Did she share her meals with others? The thought was disturbing, as if one might go to Grandma's house for dinner and unknowingly be served something sinister. On July 29, 2015, Tamara was taken to the Frunze District Court of St. Petersburg. In a striking move, they placed her in a cage in the courtroom. "I'm being treated like an animal," she exclaimed. But given the nature of her crimes, many felt it was justified. Despite being caged, Tamara still managed to speak with journalists. She addressed the media, saying, "I knew this day would come." She lamented that the whole city would learn of her actions. In a bizarre twist, she claimed to be haunted by a maniac who forced her to kill, suggesting she might have been hearing voices in her head. Throughout the court proceedings, Tamara displayed strange behavior. Sometimes she hid her face in her hands, seemingly ashamed that everyone would know what she had done. Other times, she cried, possibly embarrassed about her ruined reputation. Yet there were moments when she sat up proudly, even flirting with the court and media, blowing kisses and fixing her hair as if trying to appear charming. At one point during the trial, she acted confused about her surroundings. People wondered if she was putting on an act or genuinely lost. In a translation of what she told the judge, Tamara stated that all the killings were deliberate and that for the last 10 years, she had been preparing for this day. She expressed a desire to be known as a serial killer, which seemed contradictory to her erratic behavior in court. After killing Valentina, she realized she had nowhere to live and thought, I might as well just live in prison. So, she decided to confess to her crimes. This was puzzling, especially since she had claimed her apartment was being renovated. It was hard to know what to believe from her. In court, Tamara told the judge that she was guilty and deserved punishment. When the judge announced that she would be held in custody, Tamara smiled and clapped her hands, seemingly pleased with the outcome. She was taken to jail while awaiting trial, and the police continued their investigation. Despite her confessions about multiple murders, it was difficult for investigators to trust Tamara's words. She had shared many colorful stories that often contradicted each other. At one point, she claimed to be an actress and a graduate of the prestigious Vaganova Academy of Russian Ballet. Then she changed her story again, saying she worked at one of the city's finest hotels. This left police struggling to piece together the truth. While Tamara presented herself as a confused old lady, the investigators reviewed CCTV footage that showed her dumping bags into the pond. They also had footage of her carrying a saucepan believed to contain body parts, but they never found it. The whereabouts of those crucial pieces remained a mystery. By November 2015, Tamara had been in custody for several months as she awaited trial. The court ordered a psychological evaluation, which revealed that she posed a danger to herself and society. This assessment led to her transfer in December 2015 to a special psychiatric prison in Kazan while the police completed their investigation. During the investigation, police spoke with Tamara's family, neighbors, and friends. Many recalled that Tamara often bragged about becoming famous one day. She claimed she would cause a sensation, though she never explained what kind of sensation she meant. This left people wondering if she was hinting at something darker. One neighbor, who had known Tamara for about 15 years, mentioned her fascination with the notorious serial killer Andrei Chikatilo, also known as the Red Ripper. This man had killed and eaten at least 52 women in the late 70s and 90s. The neighbor noted that Tamara seemed to have extensive knowledge about Chikatilo and his crimes. Interestingly, the neighbor shared a peculiar memory. Tamara would often sit topless with her back to the window. I don't know how I know that, the neighbor admitted, but I just know she did it a lot. He added that Tamara was quite attractive, which felt like an unnecessary detail but was part of his account. Amidst these observations, the neighbor also revealed something potentially significant. Tamara had once borrowed their hacksaw and never returned it. In light of her later crimes, this detail took on a chilling significance. The investigation further uncovered that Tamara had been in and out of mental institutions at least 3 times over the past 15 years. Doctors had suspected she suffered from schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a serious mental disorder that can involve hallucinations and delusions, making it a frightening condition. Tamara had mentioned feeling haunted by a maniac in her head, which could have been a manifestation of her illness. While this does not excuse her actions, it added complexity to her case. Investigators also spoke with one of Tamara's school friends, who revealed a shocking claim. Tamara had allegedly killed her own mother-in-law. The friend was hesitant to come forward because Tamara had threatened her, saying, "If you say anything, I will cut you up into pieces and throw you out to the dogs." Fearing for her safety, the friend decided to keep quiet. As police gathered information from Tamara's acquaintances, she remained in treatment at a special hospital. There, she was officially diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and deemed unfit to stand trial. The judge ordered that Tamara spend the rest of her life in a mental institution due to her ongoing threat to herself and others. She required close monitoring for years to come. There were also lingering questions about the number of victims Tamara may have had. Investigators believed she could be responsible for more murders than initially thought. Some reports suggested she had killed as many as 11 people, while others claimed the number could be as high as 14. Many of these potential victims were tenants who had mysteriously disappeared from her life. However, confirming these claims proved difficult since the police lacked solid evidence beyond Tamara's diary and her own confessions. Without a body, proving anything can be incredibly difficult. However, Tamara's diary made chilling references to both cannibalism and the occult, leading many to wonder if her interest in black magic was connected to her crimes. Investigators also suspected that Tamara had killed and dismembered her husband, Alexei, the very man she claimed had run off with another woman. At this point, it seemed plausible, but again, there was no way to confirm these suspicions since no bodies had been found. As for Tamara, she was still alive, residing in a high-security psychiatric prison hospital. This fact surprised some people. One source from the investigation remarked that we may never fully understand the extent of her killings. Perhaps one day she would provide a complete confession, but many doubted it would happen anytime soon. Some suggested that releasing her diary to the public could shed light on her motives. It would certainly be intriguing to read, even if it would be unsettling. The story of Tamara Samsonova is one of a killer who seemed to murder without clear reason. Unlike many female murderers who often kill out of passion or for financial gain, Tamara appeared to kill simply for the thrill of it. This lack of motive made her case particularly rare and perplexing. It raised questions about her mental state and what drove her to commit such horrific acts. Imagine waking up one day to discover that your grandmother was a serial killer. It would be a shocking revelation. As the investigation continues, many are left wondering what truly motivated Tamara's actions. Her story remains a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives.